In the cold silence beneath the earth, far below the wind and the sky, there lies a world carved from stone and sweat, where daylight never reaches, and time does not flow like it does above. This is a place where men descend each day with eyes dulled by routine, hands roughened by labor, and lungs full of dust that never clears. There are no seasons in the mine, no sunrise or sunset, no beginning or end. Only the rhythm of pickaxes against salt and the creak of carts carrying pale crystals out into the light. This story follows one of those men, not a hero, not a name remembered in books, but a body among many, a quiet soul who rose, walked, worked, and slept until even his dreams were heavy with the weight of stone. His life was not written in ink, but in salt and scars and silence. He did not ask questions. He did not rebel. He simply endured, day after day, year after year. And as we slip slowly into the story, into the tunnels and dim corridors, let the weight of the world above melt away. Let your breath grow slower, your thoughts gentler, and your body still. For in the salt mine, there is no rush, only stillness, only darkness, only the long, quiet echo of lives slowly worn away beneath the earth. There was no path to the mine that wasn't already scarred by the weight of centuries, its winding trail carved deep into the cold belly of the earth by boots and bare feet that came before, by wheelbarrows that squealed under iron bolts, and by the steady, reluctant procession of beasts and men who had long since forgotten the warmth of freedom. The land surrounding the salt mine was not lush or generous or even temperate. It was bleak, a forgotten patch of earth whose thin trees leaned away from the wind as if trying to escape the taste of salt that hung in the air like a curse. The sky above was almost always gray, not the heavy storm gray that brings drama and noise, but the flat, muffled kind that dulled the sun to a dim smear, barely distinguishable from the clouds, a sky that gave neither promise nor threat, just an unchanging weight, like damp will press to the face. And beneath that silent sky, just past the tree line where birds stopped singing and moss stopped growing, there stood the opening, a jagged wound in a rock face that descended into something far older than time, older than stories, older even in the memory of who first dug down into the veins of salt and decided that it could be harvested like grain. There were no signs nailed above the entrance, no board scrawled with warnings or names. The mine had no name, because naming something was a gesture of familiarity or hope, and neither of those things belonged here. It was simply known as the place down below, or in muttered breath, the hollow. The entrance was low and wide, just tall enough for a grown man to bow his head as he stepped through, an act which many imagined was a form of reverence, though none could say what God or power resided in the dark. Inside, the air changed immediately. What had been cold outside became freezing inside, but not the kind of clean cold one might feel on a mountaintop or in falling snow. This was a wet, oppressive cold that slithered beneath layers of cloth, that seeped into bones and stayed there, refusing to leave even hours after men emerged. The salt hung in the air in particles so fine they could not be seen, only tasted. On the lips, on the tongue, and the throat, a bitter metallic sting that never truly went away. It coated the walls in pale residue, glittering faintly in the dim torchlight like frost, except there was no beauty in it. Only the sharp reminder that everything down here was stripped of comfort, bleached of warmth, scoured to its essence. The men who worked in the mine were not miners by choice, and they were not men in the full sense anymore, at least not as they had once been. Some were born into the labor, their fathers having been swallowed by the mine before them. Others had come from distant villages, drawn by promises of coin or punishment, or by the invisible hand of fate that guided desperate men toward places where desperation could be mined like ore. Their bodies, at first glance, all bore the same pale crust, salt embedded into folds of their skin, the creases of their knuckles, the corners of their eyes. But their suffering was not uniform. Each man carried it differently, some with dull resignation, others with silent rage, and a few, always a few, with the hollow stillness of those who had long since stopped counting the days or caring if they ended. Work began before sunrise, not that the sun had much to do with it. A bell rang at the mouth of the shaft, a dull iron clang that vibrated through stone and silence alike, and the men lined up without being told, without speaking. Tools were handed out, not clean or sharp, but worn wooden handles with cracked iron heads, chipped at the edges and wrapped in rags. There were no gloves, no helmets, No protections of any kind. The salt would tear at their skin, and it would be expected. Some men tried to wrap their hands in cloth, but always soaked through. The salt found its way in. That was the rule of the mine. Everything was invaded, slowly, eventually, until there was no distinction between man and mineral. They descended in groups, torches flickering against the curved walls, the air growing colder and denser as they went down, each step echoing in muffled dread. The tunnels were narrow, barely wide enough to pass through in single file, and some sloped sharply, requiring the men to crawl or slide down worn paths that had once been stairs, long eroded to slick ramps of packed salt and stone. Inside the mine, time stretched and snapped like an old rope. Minutes bled into hours, and hours bled into something unmeasurable. Men swung pickaxes at the glistening walls until their muscles failed, until their fingers cramped, until their minds began to detach from their hands as a form of mercy. The salt was harder than it looked, dense and unforgiving. It did not come off in neat chunks, but in jagged, sharp pieces that cut as they fell. Dust filled the air, clogging nostrils, crusting in beards, settling in the corners of eyes that blinked rarely and with difficulty. Water was provided in barrels, but it tasted of copper and decay, and men drank only enough to keep their tongues from cracking. There were no meals, only breaks where one could sit in the dark and chew on cold bread or salted meat, which tasted too similar to the air to offer any joy. Men did not talk during these breaks, not because they were forbidden to, but because language itself seemed to shrivel in the salt air, as if words had no place in a world built entirely from silence, pain, and repetition. There were always accidents. Pickaxes swinging too wide in the dim light, stones falling from ceilings that had not been checked, shafts collapsing without warning. When it happened, there was no outcry, no alarms, no rescue. If the body was retrievable, it was hauled out by the legs and dumped near the surface to be buried later, if at all. If it wasn't, then the mine simply shifted course, the path rerouted. The name of the lost man slowly rubbed away from the memory of those still swinging. And yet, for all of this, the mine did not slow. It demanded more. More salt, more skin, more labor. And so the men continued, each day not a new one, but a repetition of the last, a cycle of descent, impact, withdrawal, and collapse. And when the day ended, when the bell rang again and the men shuffled out with trembling legs and torn boots, blinking into the gray light that seemed no different from the darkness below, they did not speak, did not smile, did not stretch their backs or lift their heads. They simply made their way to the sheds, where rows of wooden cots awaited them, each one marked not by a name, but by the stains of sweat and salt that had seeped into the fabric over weeks and months. Some men collapsed immediately, their eyes rolling back before their bodies even settled. Others lay awake, staring at the beams above, tracing the salt veins that crept even to the wood. And as they closed their eyes, if they managed to sleep, they dreamed not escape, but more tunnels, more stone, more tools, because the mine did not end at the shaft. It continued in their minds, in their limbs, in their lungs. It followed them into sleep, into memory, and, eventually, into death. And yet, the next morning, the bell would ring once more. There was something peculiar about the way the bells sounded each morning, something hollow and too precise, as though the air itself had memorized its cadence and now answered out of habit rather than need, sending that dull metallic echo across the ground like a whisper calling the men back into their unending descent. It did not wake them so much as it stirred them, dragging them gently out of that thin and colorless sleep, with a mind still hovered at the edge of their dreams, and depositing them once again into the pale gray of the waking world, where nothing ever truly changed except the depth of their exhaustion. Rising from their bunks, the men did not speak. They moved with the slow, synchronized rhythm of creatures long trained to conserve every unnecessary motion, the joints of their knees crackling softly like brittle paper as they swung their legs over the edges of their cots. There were no uniforms, only layers of fabric stained the color of soil and sweat and dust, garments that had once belonged to others and had long since lost all texture to the creeping grip of salt. Shoes, if they still had them, were worn with holes that bared twisted toes and yellow nails, and those without simply wrapped cloth around their feet until the blood and the brine became indistinguishable. Outside the barracks, the air was no fresher than what filled the mine, only thinner, as if the wind itself hesitated to pass through this place. A low mist drifted over the gravel, curling around the men's ankles as they walked, heads bowed against a breeze that offered no comfort. The foreman, if it could be called that, was a silent figure in a long coat that brushed the tops of his boots, his face obscured by a cap pulled low and a scarf that left only the eyes visible. He did not bark orders, nor did he offer greetings or inspections. He simply stood near the shaft entrance with a small ledger tucked beneath one arm, marking the beginning of another day with a rusting pen, its nib worn down from countless check marks and crosses. It was said, though no one could remember who first whispered it, that the ledger did not track labor but merely tallied the names of those who had not returned from below, a quiet memorial that would one day fill its last page. There was no ceremony to enter the mine, just a shuffling line, and the slow procession of boots on damp stone as the men stepped back into the darkness, back into the belly of the earth, where salt ruled with a silent, merciless authority. The torches along the walls had been relit before dawn by the night crew, their small orange flames dancing low against the stone, throwing elongated shadows that stretched like reaching fingers along the jagged walls. The deeper one descended, the more the light seemed to struggle, not because the flames dimmed, but because the salt itself absorbed it, swallowing color and warmth until even the brightest fire became nothing more than a weak shimmer reflected in crystal dust. Breathing grew more difficult as they descended, not from lack of air, but because the air itself had weight, saturated with a fine, invisible grit of powdered salt, a substance that slipped in the lungs and nostrils with every breath and clung to the soft tissues inside like smoke that never dispersed. Deeper in the mine, the tunnels branched like roots, narrow arteries carved by decades of effort, each one twisting off into new depths, some barely high enough for a man to crawl through on hands and knees, others opening into crude caverns where the salt had once been plentiful and now echoed with the quiet scraping of tools against what remained. In one such tunnel, barely wider than a coffin, the men worked in shifts of two, one to strike with a pickaxe and another to gather what fell, loading it into low carts that would be dragged back to the shaft when full. These carts had no wheels, only thick wooden runners that groaned against the rock as they were pulled, leaving behind faint trails in the salt like scars. The men pulling them did not speak to the diggers, nor did they ask for rest or assistance. They simply moved in silence, muscles quivering beneath the crust of sweat and dust, backs permanently bent from years of dragging burdens through tunnels too low to allow standing. The salt itself was never clean. It was jagged, irregular, and cruel, its shards capable of slicing through flesh with the same ease as a blade. The hands of the men were marked with hundreds of such cuts, most of them shallow, but some deep enough to expose the pale tendons beneath. These wounds rarely healed, because the salt ensured that they remained open, irritated, inflamed. Infection was common. A scratch one day became a swelling the next, and within a week the flesh around it blackened and peeled away. There were no doctors in the mine. Only a small room near the entrance where the wounded were taken to lie down and sweat through their fever in solitude. Some survived. Most did not. When a man died, his body was carried to the edge of the forest at night, when the wind was strong enough to carry away the smell. There were no gravestones. The forest floor became their resting place. Shallow graves dug quickly with shovels and covered in pine needles and frost. The salt also crept into mind, though this was hard to describe. Men became quiet after a few months, even those who had once been spirited or defiant. Their voices softened, their eyes dulled, and their movements lost their urgency. It was not fatigue exactly, though there was no shortage of that. It was something deeper, as if the mind had reached inside and turned down the volume of their thoughts. They forgot names. They forgot time. Some stopped responding when spoken to, merely staring past their companions with eyes that no longer focused. Laughter disappeared first, then storytelling, then memory. The mind did not scream or threaten or punish with fury. It simply eroded slowly, endlessly, until there was nothing left to resist it. There were whispers, of course. Late at night, when the wind hissed through the cracks in the wooden walls and the sound of coughing echoed softly from cot to cot, men sometimes spoke of shapes moving in the tunnels, of sound like footsteps behind them when no one was there, of walls that seemed to pulse, of shadows that did not follow the rules of light. Some said the mind was alive, not in a metaphorical sense, but truly aware, watching, consuming, adapting. Others believed it to be cursed, built atop some ancient place of suffering, its veins of salt soaked not just in water, but in something darker. But most said nothing. Belief required energy, and in the mind, energy was spent on movement, on breathing, on staying upright long enough to swing the axe one more time before the bell rang again. And so they continued, each day a repetition of the last, each hour stretching across the senses like a dull knife pulled slowly through the mind. There was no end in sight, no moment of release or reprieve. Only the salt, only the weight, only the long procession of lives, slowly ground into dust beneath the surface of the earth. And still, the bell would call again. It was a strange thing, the way the mind adjusted to suffering when given no other option, how it slowly bent and reformed itself to accommodate the weight of pain, not by resisting it, but by folding it inward until it became indistinguishable from the ordinary rhythm of existence. In the salt mine, this bending happened gradually, almost invisibly, until one day a man would realize, if he still had the clarity left to realize anything at all, that the ache in his shoulders, the sting in his eyes, the constant buzzing in his ears were not anomalies, but companions, as familiar as breath, as constant as heartbeat. And so, even as the salt burned through skin and crept into the lungs, even as the darkness inside the tunnel seemed to press more heavily with each descent, the men continued on, not because they believed in anything, neither wage, nor future, nor escape, but because the idea of stopping had simply ceased to exist. To stop was to disappear. To continue was to remain, even if what remained was only the flickering image of a body moving forward out of habit. They rarely saw the surface in daylight. Though the sun did rise and set beyond the gray veil of clouds that always lingered above the region, its light rarely reached the mind's mouth with any conviction, and most shifts began and ended in a light so dim it seemed more like the suggestion of brightness than illumination itself. When the men emerged, blinking and coated in a crust of salt that cracked when they moved, they did not look to the sky. There was nothing there for them. Their eyes, long adjusted to the flicker of torchlight and the monochrome glow of subterranean shadows, found no comfort in open air. They moved toward the sleeping sheds by memory, by routine, by a kind of shared instinct that did not require vision or thought. And when they lay down once more in garments stiff with dried sweat and grit, they did not speak of the day just past. They did not complain or recount or imagine. They simply closed their eyes and waited for unconsciousness to take them or not. Dreams, when they came, were rarely kind. It was not uncommon for a man to begin weeping in his sleep, silently at first, with tears that carved little clean paths through the salt on his cheeks, then more violently, with shudders and cries that echoed to the wooden walls and disturbed the uneasy stillness of the barracks. No one comforted him. No one rose to quiet him. They understood too intimately that such outbursts were not lapses, but symptoms, flares of memory breaking through the numbness, reminders of what had been lost or buried. Some men spoke aloud in their sleep, voices raw and childlike, calling names that no longer had meaning here. Mother, brother, Anna, Tomas, home. But those names were foreign to the mind, unwelcome syllables from another life. And as dawn approached, the bell would ring again and those same men would rise, bleary-eyed and silent. The tears dried, the memories once again pushed deep beneath the surface of thought, where salt could not dissolve them quite so easily. In the far reaches of the mine, where the oldest tunnels lay abandoned and the ceilings drooped with the weight of centuries, there were legends passed quietly between the men. Legends not of gold or buried treasure, but of rooms, vast and hollow, filled not with salt but with silence so deep it could swallow a scream. These places, it was said, had once been full of workers like them, but something had gone wrong. A collapse, perhaps, or a fire, or worse, something unseen. Whatever had happened, the rooms were sealed now, blocked off by crude stone barriers and marked with black crosses scratched into the rock. No one was sent to work there anymore. The salt had been exhausted, and so had the men. Still, sometimes, when the tunnels grew quiet and the drip of water paused just long enough to hear one's own heartbeat, a man might swear he heard voices echoing from the sealed corridors. Soft, rhythmic chants or breathless whispers too faint to understand. Most dismissed these as tricks of exhaustion, as the mind's rebellion against silence. But others, particularly the newer men, those who had not yet grown fully numb, would pause their work and listen longer than they should, heads cocked, eyes wide, as though hoping to recognize a word, a phrase, something human. They never did, and eventually they would return to their tools. The moment passed, the unease buried. There were no celebrations in the mine, no holidays or rituals to mark the passage of time. Birthdays were forgotten, and the changing of seasons meant little in a world where winter was eternal, where snow and salt looked the same, and where the cold never lifted, only shifted in texture. Sometimes a man would arrive, young, strong, with eyes still alert and hands not yet calloused, and he would try at first to carve out moments of cheer, a story told during a meal, a song hummed under breath, a carved token offered as a gift. But the mind had no patience for such things. The stories were met with silence. The songs were drowned by coughing. The gifts were left behind when the bell rang. And slowly, that brightness faded, like light dimming behind fog glass, until the man's voice matched the others, low and spare, spoken only when necessary and never with hope. Even the strongest, in time, bent to the mind's rhythm. It was not a matter of if, only when. One man, they said, had kept a journal, not with paper and ink, which had not survived the salt, but by carving tiny marks in the underside of his bunk. One mark for each day survived, each shift completed. The others had watched him do it, at first with curiosity, then with quiet pity, and finally with indifference. No one stopped him. It was a harmless defiance, like whispering to oneself or scratching an itch. He continued for months, perhaps longer, the marks multiplying until they became a pattern of lines and notches that looked almost like language. Then one day, the man did not return from the mine. No one knew why. No one asked. His bunk was taken by someone else before the next bell rang, and the marks, slowly, were rubbed away by the salt-laced skin of another man's sleep. This was how things went. Not with drama, not with violence, but with quiet, steady erasure. The mind did not crush men all at once. It wore them down piece by piece, like waves smoothing stone, like wind fading paint. A laugh gone here, a memory forgotten there, the ability to cry, then the desire to speak, then the capacity to imagine anything beyond the next ascent. Even pain eventually lost its edge. It became texture, like the salt in the air or the cold in the stone, something constant, something expected. And so the men worked. They hauled. They broke. They bled. They returned to the surface, only to wait for the next call. There was no rebellion, no escape, only the long, slow drift into a kind of waking sleep, a life flattened into repetition, so profound that it became, in its own way, eternal. And through it all, the bell still rang, its sound neither mournful nor urgent, simply inevitable. There was a saying among the older men, though no one could quite recall who had first whispered it into the dim light of the sleeping sheds, or scratched it quietly onto the wall behind the water barrel, where few dared to look too long. The salt remembers. It was not said with reverence or fear, but with a detached, matter-of-fact tone that one might use to describe the hardness of the ground or the wetness of rain, something so deeply accepted that it no longer needed discussion. They believed, or half-believed, that the salt knew their names, their injuries, their failings, that it watched with kind of slow, cruel patience as they moved deeper into its veins each day, letting them mine and cut and load, while silently marking which of them would falter next. It was not superstition, not exactly. Rather, it was a quiet recognition that nothing within the mine's walls was ever truly lost. Not blood, not sweat, not footsteps. Every sound echoed, every injury lingered, and every man who passed into the mine left some part of himself behind, whether he knew it or not. This idea, this feeling of being watched, not by eyes, but by the mind itself, grew stronger the deeper one worked. In the lowest shafts, where the air was thickest and the torchlight barely clung to the walls, men spoke even less, though they worked in pairs for safety. Here, the silence was different, not just quiet, but dense, as if the sound had been pulled out of the air and packed into the salt itself, trapped there alongside the ancient weight of centuries. Tools struck walls with muffled cracks. Breathing sounded loud and irregular, and when a man paused, if only for a heartbeat, he might hear something faint, like a breath not his own, or a footstep from behind a bend in the tunnel where no one should be. No one admitted to hearing these things. But when they emerged, eyes red from salt dust and faces lined with streaks where sweat had carved channels through grime, they all shared a certain look, a tightness in the jaw, a constant flicking of the gaze toward corners where nothing moved. The salt, they whispered, didn't just remember, it listened. Food was a part of life in the mine, but not in the sense that it nourished or comforted. It was merely functional, served not to please but to prevent collapse. Each day, a cart arrived just after dusk, pushed by a boy too young or too broken to mind. On it were bowls filled with a kind of broth, thin, pale, made from dried root vegetables and preserved meat that had long since lost a distinction of flavor. Bread was issued once a week, a hard, blackened loaf that cracked when bitten and often needed to be soaked in the broth to be eaten at all. There was no sharing, no barter. Each man received the same portion, placed it beside his cot, and ate in silence if he ate at all. Some let it sit untouched for hours, staring at it as if uncertain whether their bodies still required food. Others consumed it methodically, slowly chewing each bite with the rhythm of a man counting steps, not out of hunger, but habit. Meals were not moments of reprieve, but another routine. Another box checked, another function fulfilled, another reminder that they were still tethered to the surface by the most basic of needs. Illness came often, and when it came hard. The salt itself made healing difficult, the constant abrasion of particles in the air inflaming even the smallest cuts into festering sores. Respiratory sickness was most common. Men who once laughed now wheezed when they walked, their chests rattling with each breath like sacks of broken glass. Fever was another regular guest, arriving in waves and leaving men trembling beneath thin blankets, soaked through with sweat that dried the crust of salt. There were no medicines, no salves. A single cloth soaked in cold water served as both comfort and cure, passed from man to man until it, too, reeked of the mine. The sick were not separated. They lay among the others, their coughs becoming part of the night's rhythm, their shivers barely noticed amid the ceaseless creaking of bunks and the sigh of wind through the gaps in the planks. When one died, it was expected. When two died, it was noted. When more died, the foreman would appear with extra tools and fewer words. There were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when the outside world tried to intrude. A bird might land near the entrance, peering curiously into the gloom before fluttering away. A letter, worn thin with folds, might arrive from a distant town, addressed in a trembling hand, and read aloud in the barracks to ears that barely listened. A traveler, perhaps on some errand from the capital, might ride past and glance at the mine with a mixture of pity and discomfort before continuing down the road, never stopping. These were not interruptions so much as reminders, whispers from another existence, one where seasons still changed and meals still held flavor, where voices laughed and hands held warmth. But the mind was quick to erase such intrusions. By the next shift, the bird was forgotten. The letter became kindling. The traveler passed out of memory, like a dream evaporating with morning. The mind had a rhythm that was not bound by the hours on a clock or the cycles of the moon. It moved at its own pace, dictated not by time but by depletion, of salt, of men, of light. When a tunnel gave no more, it was sealed. When a man gave no more, he was replaced. There was no ceremony in either act. The salt did not celebrate. It simply continued to absorb. It did not cry out when chipped or cracked or carried away. It did not bleed or scream. But in its silence, it consumed more than rock. It consumed identity. It consumed memory. It consumed whatever pieces of the soul still flickered in the dark corners of men who labored there, until all that remained was movement, repetition, breath. And so the days passed, or what could be called days in a place where no sun reached, where the only true marker time was the sound of that iron bell tolling again and again and again. Each ring a summons, a command, a reminder, the bell that called them down, the bell that sent them back up, the bell that never changed, even as every man beneath it did, each one becoming a little more hollow, a little more silent, a little more salt with every passing hour. And deep below, in the farthest chamber where no one had worked in years, the salt crystals continued to grow. The salt crystals in that farthest chamber, where no tools had been swung in a generation, and no footsteps echoed louder than the occasional shifting of stone, did not grow in any way that could be measured by the clock or the calendar. They advanced not with urgency, but with the same quiet certainty that guided the mind itself, a slow and ceaseless accumulation, molecule by molecule, layer upon invisible layer, forming spires and ridges that twisted in the dark like frozen smoke. There was something both beautiful and unsettling about them, a geometry too precise to be natural, too natural to be designed. No one visited that chamber now. The path to it had collapsed decades ago in a gentle but final rumble that had taken 3 men and a mule with it. Their names had been recorded in the ledger, and their cots filled the following morning. The entrance to that shaft had been sealed off with stone in silence, and in time, even its direction was forgotten. But the salt remained hidden and untouched, growing in the dark like a secret too large to tell. There were rumors, of course, about what lay beyond those blocked-off tunnels. Quiet stories traded under breath during the rare moments when men still bothered to speak at all. Some claimed that the crystals there sang, not with voices, but with vibrations so faint they could only be felt through the soles of one's boots, like the hum of something enormous and unseen just below the edge of knowing. Others said the air in that place was warmer, strangely warm, and thick enough to slow the beating of the heart, a place where time bent in sleep came too quickly, too heavily, like sinking into syrup. But these were stories, not beliefs, and even the tellers seemed uncertain whether they had heard them or invented them themselves in one of the long, flickering silences between shifts. No one asked to be sent to that part of the mine, even if it had still been reachable, and no one offered to find it. Instead, they worked where the tunnels remained open, and the walls still bled salt when struck. The picks swung in rhythmic arcs, not with energy, but with resignation. Each impact a note in a song without melody, without end. Dust rose with every strike, swirling around their faces like gray mist, clinging to their brows, their lips, the insides of their nostrils. The older men had long since stopped wiping it away. It would only return. Better to let it settle, to become part of the skin. Some began to look more statue than man, their features dulled and obscure beneath layers of fine powder, their eyes blinking slowly from sockets crusted with salt. When they returned to the surface, their faces looked ghost-like in the dim light, and sometimes a new arrival, seeing them for the first time, would mistake them for spirits or specters, not yet realizing that this was what life above the mine did to a man's face. The younger ones didn't last long. Strong as they often were, back straight, hands calloused from farms or forests, eyes still full of questions. They quickly learned that strength did not matter here, not in the long run. It might carry them through the first few weeks, allow them to lift heavier loads or strike harder blows, but eventually, the mine would settle into their bones like cold water through cracks in stone. Joints would begin to swell. Breathing would grow shallow. The spark behind their eyes would flicker, and before long, they would move like the rest, slowly, with caution, conserving energy not because of wisdom, but because they had already begun to understand that there was no end to the work, only the illusion of progress. One tunnel opened, another collapsed, one man died, another arrived. The salt flowed from the mine in carts pulled along groaning tracks toward the surface, where it was weighed, packed, and sent away to places the miners would never see, into kitchens, onto roads, into brine barrels and city fountains and noble tables. But here, underground, the salt remained the same, sharp, dry, endless. Some men tried to keep track of how much salt they had extracted in a day, tallying it quietly on the inside of their sleeves with tiny needle pricks or notched bits of thread. It was a form of counting, a way to reclaim time, to prove that the day had meant something, even if only in quantity. But the numbers grew meaningless. 10 sacks, 20, 30, it made no difference. The salt always returned. It replenished itself in the cracks. It fell in flakes from the ceiling. It shimmered in the pools that gathered near the lowest walls, water so saturated it stung the skin to touch it. It was as though the mine itself exhaled salt, breathed it into being, offered it in endless supply, so long as there were hands willing to bleed and backs willing to bend. No one ever spoke of leaving. It was not forbidden, but it was also not imaginable. To leave would require explanation, destination, purpose, and none of these things survived long in the mine. The men could no longer recall where they had come from. Only vague memories of sky and trees, and voices not shaped like orders. Their hometowns blurred together in their minds. Their families became sketches. The shape of mother's voice replaced by the echo of the bell. Some might have been sent here in punishment, others in poverty. Some had even arrived by choice in years long past, when coin had meant more than breath. But none of that mattered anymore. The mind had no interest in pasts. It only consumed the present, over and over, until the men themselves began to dissolve into it. Slowly, silently, like salt and water. Even dreams began to change. In the beginning, men dreamed of escape, of fields, of women's hands and summer winds. But over time, those visions grew more distant, more abstract, and eventually were replaced by dreams of tunnels, of dripping stone, of endless corridors that led nowhere. Some would wake in the middle of the night, gasping, not because of terror, but because the dream had been too real. They had been back in the mine, digging, dragging, bleeding, only to find they had never truly left. Others stopped dreaming altogether. Their minds, exhausted beyond repair, chose silence over imagery, and their sleep became a kind of blank pause, a quiet erasure between one bell and the next. And still, the mind continued, unconcerned by the decay it caused, unmoved by the pain it harvested. It welcomed each man with the same chill breath and enveloped him in the same indifferent dark. It did not hurry. It did not rest. It simply endured, stretching deeper into the earth, winding like a serpent through layers of stone and silence, fed by the bones and sweat of those who had walked its passages. Above, the world turned. Seasons shifted, cities grew, wars began and ended. But beneath, in the belly of the salt, everything remained as it had been, as it would be, as it always would be. And as the next morning crept near, with its dull gray sky and bitter wind, the bell was already being lifted, ready once more to toll its wordless command. The bell's voice never changed, and that sameness became a kind of anchor for the men who had nothing else to measure their lives by. It rang with the same dull metallic resonance, whether it was summer or winter, whether the sky above was laced with snow or stained with soot from distant fires, whether a man had died the night before or survived a fever that had threatened to claim him. It rang with the indifference of an unbreakable clock, tolling not hours, but submission, reminding all who heard it that their lives were not their own, not truly, not anymore. When its echo reached the sleeping sheds, the sound carried through wood and flesh alike, and the men stirred in unison, not with the alarm twitch of waking from nightmares, but with the mechanical rhythm of things trained to obey. Their bodies moved before their thoughts could catch up. Legs swung out, arms lifted, eyes blinked against the dim. There were no words exchanged, no muttered greetings or complaints, only the soft shuffle of calloused feet across the splintering floors, and the faint rustle of worn fabric slipping over salt-stiffened skin. Outside, the wind had picked up again, as it often did in the early hours before the grayest part of dawn. It blew low and fast, carried with it a thin, bitter dust that collected around the mine's mouth, fine particles that had long since stripped the bark from nearby trees and left their trunks bare and pale as bones. Nothing grew near the mine anymore, not grass, not moss, not even stubborn vines that crept through stone in other places. The earth here was too dry, too hungry. It drank everything, rain, blood, sound, and left behind only the faint shimmer of salt that coated every surface like frost that never melted. The men didn't flinch at the wind. They had no scarves, no goggles, no layers to protect them. They turned their faces downward, hunched their shoulders, and moved forward, drawn once more to the mouth of the shaft of the slow, resigned gait of beasts too tired to resist the pull of the harness. The descent was always the same. The path curved and dipped, twisting through the earth like a wound that refused to close. Torches mounted along the walls flickered low, casting soft halos of light that barely reached the floor, their flames constantly threatened by the dampness that seeped through the stone. Every footstep echoed, but the echoes were not true. They came back slower than they should, distorted by distance and density, shaped by the peculiar acoustics of tunnels too narrow and too old to carry sound in a straight line. Sometimes a man could hear his own step repeated back to him a moment too late, or in the wrong direction, as if something deep in the mind had mimicked it. Imperfectly, intentionally, the deeper one went the more those echoes became companions. Unseen, untrusted, work began without signal. There was no overseer's bark, no horn, no clatter of chains. Each man arrived at his assigned tunnel and took up his tools, left there the night before or leaning just where he had dropped them at the last shift's end. The handles were splintered and smooth in equal measure, polished by blood and sweat, wrapped in rags that had hardened over time into stiff, salty shells. The iron heads were dull, chipped at the corners, worn into shapes no longer sharp enough to cut cleanly. Still, they struck the salt. Again, again, again. The rhythm of the blows was uneven, some fast and angry, some slow and labored, but they blended into a low, continuous music that filled the space like a chant hummed through clenched teeth. No one sang, but the mind, in its own way, did. Salt dust rose with every strike, a fine, glimmering mist that clung to skin and hair and lashes. It coated the lips with a sting. It burned the eyes. It slipped into the lungs with every breath, no matter how shallow, and nested there. Over time, the men's voices changed. They grew huskier, more ragged, as if ground from stone. Many coughed quietly, hiding the sound in their sleeves or behind the clatter of tools. Some carried rags stained with pink or brown, and when these stains grew darker, they simply buried the cloth and began again with another. There were no medics, no treatments. The mind took what it wanted. Healing was a concept that belonged to other places, other lives. Lighting in the deeper tunnels was unpredictable. Torches burned low, often flickering out without warning, leaving men to work in half darkness or by feel alone. Some wore small candles strapped to their foreheads, but wax was precious, and when it ran out, it wasn't always replaced. Those who lost their light simply continued by memory, swinging where they thought the walls should be, feeling with their fingers the rough edge of what had already been broken away. Eyes adjusted or they didn't. The dark was indifferent. It softened shapes, dulled distance, transformed tunnels into dreamscapes where direction and space could no longer be trusted. Men stumbled more often down there, tripped on uneven stone, tore their skin on salt spurs that jutted like broken teeth from the walls. Some fell and did not rise for hours. When they were found, they were not helped to their feet. They were simply told to stand. And if they could not, their tools were taken, and their place was filled by someone else. There were no mirrors in the mine, no reflective surfaces at all. The last time a man had seen his own face clearly was likely in the surface world long before he'd ever heard of the mine, in a river maybe, or a window pane. Down here, identity eroded as steadily as the skin on their fingertips. They referred to each other by nicknames, gravel voice, crooked foot, twitcher, not out of cruelty, but because names had lost their relevance. No one remembered real names after a while. They were too heavy, too sharp, and the mind filed them down like everything else. Even one's own name began to feel foreign if spoken aloud. Some men went years without hearing it, and when they did, accidentally, they flinched. Sometimes a man would pause in the middle of his work, not from exhaustion or injury, but because he had suddenly forgotten what he was doing. The pickaxe in his hand felt unfamiliar. The wall before him seemed too still. He would look around, eyes wide, breathing shallow, as though waking from a dream whose logic no longer applied. These moments never lasted long. The others would not speak to him, but their presence would slowly pull him back into rhythm. A glance, a motion, a sigh, and soon he would raise the tool again, swing it forward, and the moment would pass, absorbed by the mind like everything else. And then the carts would begin to fill, slowly at first, then faster, as the walls gave up their dust and the men hauled it into containers worn thin by decades of repetition. The salt, once dragged to the upper shaft, would be winched toward the surface, the ropes creaking and groaning with the strain, dust falling like snow from the gaps in the pulley system. No one watched it go. No one celebrated a cart well filled. The product of their labor disappeared into the light above, and the men remained below, unchanged, unfinished, until the bell rang once more. Not as an end, not really, but as a pause in a rhythm, the sound that signaled they could lay down their tools for a few hours, close their eyes if they chose, and prepare to do it all again. When the bell finally told its low, deliberate summons toward the surface, the sound did not lift spirits or signal relief. It was merely a turning of the wheel, a pause in a long and endless rhythm rather than a true reprieve. The men did not speak or smile as they began their slow ascent from the depths, their movements sluggish and uneven, as if the weight of the salt had settled into the very marrow of their bones. They climbed in silence, backs bent, shoulders hunched, boots dragging against the stone floor with a sound that echoed like the rustle of dry leaves in some long-dead forest. The lanterns cast long, trembling shadows behind them, and those shadows stretched unnaturally against the walls, distorted by the flickering flames, twisting into strange and almost human shapes that danced just out of sight. Their hands, once strong, now trembled subtly, fingers bent at unnatural angles, some wrapped in cloth to hide the damage, others bare and swollen from the salt's relentless erosion. The skin across their knuckles cracked with every movement, and the air above stung their wounds more fiercely than anything they felt below, as though the light itself was hostile to them now. For those few dozen steps between the mine's mouth and the sleeping sheds, they were no longer workers or laborers or even men. They were specters, shuffling across the dead ground like memories too heavy to vanish, each one marked by the deep and invisible toll the mine had taken on its soul. Inside the sheds, the air was no warmer, but was still, and that stillness passed for comfort. The walls, made of untreated planks nailed together generations ago, creaked in the wind like old ships moored on a sea of stone. Each cot sat close to the next, separated only by narrow gaps where boots and bowls and threadbare garments were stored. There was no privacy here, no corners untouched by salt or sound. And yet, it was the closest thing to sanctuary that the men would ever know. They removed their boots with effort, fingers fumbling with laces stiff with dry brine. Clothing was peeled away slowly, layer by layer, revealing skin marble with bruises, scars, and salt burns. Pale maps of suffering etched not with fire or blade, but with endless repetition. Most did not bother to wash. The water was cold, the rags too coarse, and the grime too deep. Better to lie down as they were, stiff and aching, letting the weight of the blankets press the fatigue deeper into their bones. Sleep came quickly to some, slowly to others. There were those who sank into unconsciousness within moments, their minds already dulled beyond resistance. And there were those who lay still for hours, staring at the low ceiling, eyes wide, muscles twitching from phantom pain or from memories they could no longer fully recall. The sounds of the sleeping shed were not peaceful. They were filled with breath, shallow, wet, uneven, and the soft rustle of limbs shifting in discomfort. Occasionally, a man would mutter in his sleep, words fragmented and lost, drifting between languages or into sounds that resembled no language at all. And sometimes there would be crying, not loud, not wailing, but quiet sobs muffled beneath a blanket or stifled into a pillow, the kind of crying that comes not from sorrow, but from confusion, from the slow and irreversible unraveling of one sense of self. There was no fire in the shed. The cold was not bitter, but persistent, the kind that clung to the corners of the room and slipped beneath blankets to coil around ribs and knees. It kept the men curled tightly in their beds, arms drawn in, chins tucked low, like children hiding from a storm. Some murmured to themselves, reciting the names of loved ones, the names of places far from here, repeating them like talismans, afraid that if they stopped, they might forget them forever. And some already had. You could see it in their eyes when they awoke, not confusion exactly, but kind of emptiness, as if the dream they had left behind had been more real than the world they now re-entered. They blinked slowly, scanned the room without recognition, and then, only after a long pause, remembered where they were, and what waited for them beneath the ground once more. The walls of the shed were marked with carvings, faint lines and symbols etched over years by restless fingers. Circles, crosses, initials that meant something once, and crude figures of men carrying sacks or swinging axes. Some were tallies, scratched in long rows by men who had tried to count their days, only to stop midway and never resume. Others were more desperate, pleas to gods no longer worshipped, prayers to mothers or wives, poems that never found their endings. The salt had worn many of these inscriptions smooth, its crystal slowly consuming even the smallest acts of memory and resistance. The salt erased everything, even hope. Above, the wind howled against the shutters, rattling them in their frames. It was the only voice that spoke freely here, untouched by the mind's hunger. It moved across the landscape in long, sweeping gusts, dragging with it the scent of iron and stone and sweat. But inside the shed, the men did not hear it as song or lament. To them, it was simply part of the silence, another thread woven into the endless fabric of sameness that wrapped their lives. The storm might rage or not. It made no difference. The bell would ring either way, and their feet would rise from the floor once more. The younger ones sometimes tried to keep track of time beyond the mind. They would mark the moons with scratches near their beds, or ask passing traders what month it was, what feast days had come or gone. But eventually, even they stopped. Time did not behave the same here. Days melted into one another like snow into salt water. Indistinct, dissolved, uncountable. There were no seasons, only shifts. There were no holidays, only injuries. The calendar was replaced by the weight of the body, the pain in the knees, the cough that would not go. When a man began to forget his own age or how long he had been here, no one corrected him. No one remembered for him. The forgetting was a kind of mercy. And so they slept or tried to, wrapped in the same blankets, breathing the same dust-laden air, their dreams stitched together from memory and shadow. They did not dream of freedom. They no longer believed in it. They dreamed of tunnels, of dripping walls, of distant footfalls, of lights that flickered and would not stay lit. They dreamed of falling, slowly, endlessly, through layers of salt that did not burn, but embraced. And when they awoke, they did so without surprise, without question, as if the line between sleep and waking had grown too thin to be noticed. And somewhere not far away, the foreman stirred beside the ledger again, his pen poised for the next entry, and the bell, a weight of rusted iron and routine, stood ready to sound once more. The foreman, whose name had long ceased to matter even to himself, sat hunched beside the ledger at a table warped by moisture and stained with age, his fingers ink-streaked and slow, the pen moving with practiced reluctance that echoed the rhythm of everything in the mind. The book before him was thick and yellowed, its pages uneven, some curling at the corners, others marked with blots where the damp had soaked through. It was not a true record in any useful sense. Names were often spelled differently from one line to the next, and dates blurred as the years dissolved into sameness, but was maintained all the same, day after day, shift after shift, as if its very existence proved that someone, somewhere, still bore witness to what happened here. He filled in the columns without expression, listing the names of those who had returned, those who had not, those who had coughed blood, those who had asked to rest and been refused. He did not look up when the bell rang. He simply turned the page. Outside, the sky remained the same featureless gray it had always been, a ceiling of dull light that gave no indication of hour or season. Snow sometimes fell, drifting silently over the salt-blanched earth, but it melted quickly in the strange, invisible warmth that rose from the mind's breath, leaving behind only more damp, more mud, more traces of movement that would vanish with the next gust of wind. The men emerged from the shed one by one, their shapes barely distinguishable from one another, like figures cut from the same sheet of shadow. They moved slowly, boots crunching over the hardened ground, the fabric of their garments stiff with last shift's crusted sweat and grime. There was no spoken greeting, no acknowledgment of the foreman seated near the entrance. He did not speak to them, and they did not speak to him. Words, in this place, were for necessity only. Everything else could be left unspoken and still understood. The descent began once more, the tunnel yawning open before them with its ever-present draft, not cold or warm but simply present, like breath from a sleeping mouth. The first few steps always felt the same, the brief sensation of leaving something behind, of stepping out of the world, and into a place where light could not follow. Even those who had walked this path thousands of times still felt that subtle change, the shift in air pressure, the taste of salt growing heavier with each footfall, the sense that, once again, the earth was closing around them. The torches had been relit. Though some flickered weakly and others barely held flame, their light dim and uncertain, creating shadows that moved even when no one did. There were places in the mine where the air was so thick with dust that the torchlight looked like fog, and in those places the men squinted and shuffled carefully, their hands brushing the walls to guide them, their eyes red and raw from the sting. Far below, the salt beds glistened with the dull luster of exhaustion. The walls here were no longer smooth but jagged, carved by years of tools and sweat and erosion. Cracks snaked through the stone like veins, and in some corners, the salt crystals had grown into strange shapes, too angular, too deliberate, as if sculpted by a slow, alien hand. The men did not notice. They had long since stopped seeing the salt as anything but burden. They moved toward their tools, which waited for them like dogs loyal only to suffering, and took them up without pause, shoulders already sagging beneath the knowledge of what the day would require. There was no count, no roll call. Work began not when someone said it should, but when the first pick struck the wall. That sound, sharp, flat, echoing, was a signal, and it reverberated down the tunnels like a bell all its own, calling each man back into the rhythm. The dust rose again, stirred by every movement, every swing, every drag of sack and cart. It did not float like ordinary dust. It clung, it twisted, it settled into hair and mouth and throat, until breathing felt like swallowing sand. The men learned to ignore it, to swallow the sting, to blink through the blur, to press forward even when their chests burned with fire and their fingers refused to bend. The salt worked its way beneath their nails, into the cracks at their heels, into the folds of skin behind their ears. There was no escape from it. Even in sleep, it lingered. Even in silence, it spoke. The tunnel where old Merrick worked had grown narrower in recent weeks. The ceiling had dropped just enough that he now walked slightly bent, a posture that pulled his lower back and made his legs shake before the shift was half done. Still, he did not complain. He had been there longer than most, his hair long since gone, his beard stiff and white as ash, his breath wheezing like a bellows half filled with water. Each morning, he moved toward his station with the same slow precision, and each evening he returned with the same haunted quiet in his eyes. The others gave him space, not out of respect, but out of recognition. He had become something like a fixture of the mine, like the salt pillars or the rusted beams. He was not quite a man anymore, not quite a ghost. He was what waited at the end of all their paths. Today, he moved more slowly than usual. His right hand trembled when he lifted the pick, and for several long minutes, he stood still before the wall, staring into the jagged salt as though trying to remember what it was or why he had come. Then, with a shudder like an old tree in wind, he swung. The pick struck the wall with a dull crack. Dust puffed outward in a slow cloud. He coughed once, then again. Then silence. The others did not stop to look. Such moments were common. A man would pause. A man would cough. A man would vanish. These things did not require acknowledgement. In another tunnel, a younger worker, too young, really barely past boyhood, paused for a moment to rest. His name, if he'd shared it, was already forgotten. He leaned against the wall, breath coming fast, eyes unfocused. The salt was already inside him. It had taken root. You could see in the way he stood, the way his shoulders drooped, the way his fingers twitched against the half of the pick as though unsure whether to continue. After a minute he straightened. He lifted the tool. He swung. The rhythm resumed. And so the hours passed again. There was no clock, no sun, only the aches that deepened, the blisters that split, the air that thickened. When the bell rang next, they would return to their cots with salt in their mouths and their dreams filled with stone. Nothing would have changed. Nothing ever did. Only the salt grew stronger, and the men grew weaker, one breath at a time. The rhythm of the mine was so deeply embedded in the men that even in stillness their bodies remembered it. Their muscles tightening in patterns learned through repetition, their fingers curling as if to grip invisible tools, their shoulders flinching ever so slightly with the echo of each remembered blow. In the few hours between shifts, when their bodies were permitted to collapse into the creaking cots and their eyes shut against the dull, smoky air, they did not rest as other men rested. Their sleep was fractured and uneasy, filled with a dull ache of unfinished motion, as if the salt itself continued to work inside their bones long after their picks had been dropped. Dreams came and went like shadows crossing a tunnel wall, half-formed, silent, distant. Some men dreamed of walls that bled salt when touched, of doorways that led nowhere, of voices whispering from cracks in the stone. Others dreamed only of silence, so total it pressed against their ears like water, drowning thought, memory, time. There was no true morning here. No golden light or bird call, no warmth creeping slowly through windows. The day began when the bell rang again, its metallic voice scraping to the haze of sleep, wrenching men from whatever vague comfort they had managed to find in the short hours since they last stood. They rose like smoke, slowly, painfully, their limbs stiff and unwilling, their joints popping with the effort of movement. No one stretched. No one joked. The body was not something to be admired or celebrated. It was a vessel, and it was failing. Each day chipped a little more away from it. Cartilage wore down, teeth loosened, hearing dulled, vision dimmed. They did not talk about these things. They accepted them, the way they accepted the dust in their lungs and the salt on their skin. It was the price of being here. It was the price of staying alive. The foreman no longer needed to speak instructions. Each man knew his place, his path, his tool, his tunnel. The assignments never changed, and the sameness of it all made memory irrelevant. They moved through the gray morning mist like shadows slipping back into a deeper shade of night, their eyes half-lidded, their mouths set in the grim line of endurance. The path into the mine remained unchanged, the same curve, the same descending slope, the same grown of stone beneath boot and cart. The salt seeped from the walls here, too, forming new growths each day, delicate threads of white crystal that bloomed like frost on cold mornings, only to be broken by shoulders brushing past or boots scraping too close. No one looked at them. Beauty had no place here. It only reminded them of what they had forgotten. Deeper still, in the belly of the mine, the darkness thickened. The light from the torches no longer pushed back the shadows, so much as marked the limits of vision. Everything beyond those flickering halos remained uncertain. Shapes emerged and vanished. Footsteps echoed in the wrong direction. A breeze would whisper past though no tunnel lay open ahead. But still they worked. Tools were lifted. Salt was struck. Dust filled the air like smoke, and the silence was broken only by the endless rhythm of labor. It was not the sound of industry. It was the sound of survival, reduced to its simplest form. Sometimes the mine would shift, a groan of stone, a distant rumble, a brief tremor that passed through the walls like a heartbeat. The men would freeze in those moments. Tools paused mid-swing, breath caught in their throats. But if nothing collapsed, if the ceiling held, if the walls remained still, they would resume their labor without comment. Fear had long since been trained out of them. Panic was useless here. If the mine wanted to crush them, it would. And if it did not, they would keep working. That was the way of things. In one of the older tunnels, a wall had begun to leak. Not water, but a thin briny seepage that trickled down the stone like tears. It pooled at the base of the wall, forming a shallow puddle that glimmered faintly in the dim light. No one knew why it had started or what it meant, and no one was assigned to repair it. The men simply stepped around it, lifting their sacks and carts over the wet stone as they worked. A few whispered that it was a bad sign, that the mine was bleeding. Others said nothing, unwilling to give voice to their unease. The salt had ears, they believed. It listened. It did not like being spoken of. Above ground, nothing changed. The wind moved across the barren land like a ghost, rattling through the empty trees and stirring dust from the cracked earth. The sheds remained standing, their boards worn smooth by time and breath. The foreman remained at his desk, the ledger open before him, the ink slowly spreading across its pages. Traders sometimes passed by, faces half covered with scars, horses skittish at the scent of salt and sweat that hung over the mine like fog. They did not linger. They did not ask questions. The mine was known, even to those who had never entered it. It was a place of labor, of bodies, of silence, a place where men disappeared not in death, but in life, eroded by work, dissolved into dust, carried away one breath at a time. Some of the miners had been there so long they no longer remembered their own voices. They communicated in gestures, nods, glances, the subtle movement of a shoulder or a hand. The sound of speech had become foreign to them, intrusive, as though it belonged to another world. When one of them spoke on rare occasions, the words came out stiff and cracked, like dry wood breaking. Their mouths were not used to shaping language anymore. Their tongues were rough with salt. They had become creatures of labor, stripped of everything but the ability to endure. In the evenings, after the final bell, After the carts were emptied and the tools leaned once more against the walls, the men walked back to the sheds without looking at one another. The sky, dim as ever, cast no shadows. The world above was no more alive than the one below. The only difference was that here on the surface, they could feel the wind on their faces and see the faint outline of stars if they dared to look up, but most didn't. The stars reminded them of things they no longer had, of nights long past, of voices long silenced, of lives that had slipped from them like water through cracked stone. Inside the shed, the darkness welcomed them like an old friend. The bunks creaked under their weight. The boards groaned as they settled. Blankets were pulled over weary limbs. Eyes closed slowly. And once more, the breathing of a dozen broken men filled the room like a tide coming in, steady, inevitable, slow. And just before sleep claimed them, if one listened closely, they might hear the salt, settling, whispering, waiting. The whisper of the salt was not imagined, though none of the men could have said where it came from, nor when they had first begun to notice it. It was not a voice, not precisely, but a presence, a subtle rustle, like fabric brushing stone, or the faint, persistent sigh of wind through cracks that had no surface opening. At night, when the shed was quiet and the only sounds were the low breath and shifting limbs of exhausted men, the salt seemed to stir, not with movement, but with intention, as though the mind itself exhaled something that drifted upward from the deepest chambers and slipped beneath doors and through walls to coil invisibly around those who slept above. There was no fear in this presence. Not anymore. Whatever unease it once might have caused had long since dulled into resignation. The salt did not harm directly. It did not drag men from their beds or crush them in their sleep. It simply watched and waited and seeped ever onward into the places where it will have begun to falter. Some of the oldest men of the mine had started speaking to it, though not as one might speak to a friend or a priest or even an enemy. They muttered to it under their breath while they worked, offering fragments of thought or memory in exchange for nothing. One man, his name forgotten, but known to the others by the deep scar that crossed his neck like a crooked smile, would trace shapes in the dust with the handle of his pick, crude spirals and crosses that he wiped away as soon as they were complete, whispering all the while in a language none of them recognized. No one questioned it. No one mocked him. Everyone had their way of surviving, and the mine did not care what those ways were so long as the salt was dug and the carts were filled. In one of the far tunnels, where the walls pressed so close that a man could only swing a pick with one arm, the salt had taken on a different color. It was darker there, tinged with a faint blue-gray hue that shimmered strangely in the torchlight. No one knew why. The older workers said the salt that was deeper, older, that it had been pressed and twisted by centuries of weight into something denser than the rest. Others said it was cursed, that a collapse long ago had buried a group of workers so completely that their bodies had never been recovered, and now the salt bore their memory in its coloring. Superstition, of course, but no one volunteered to work that tunnel, and those who were assigned to it went silently, shoulders hunched, breath shallow, avoiding the edges of the wall, as if the darker salt might reach out and touch them. The carts from that tunnel were always the heaviest. The salt clung to itself, reluctant to separate, as if unwilling to leave the place of its making. And still, the labor continued. Morning and night lost all meaning. The men worked when told, stopped when told, ate in silence, and returned to their cots like animals trained not by cruelty, but by absence. It was not that they were forbidden to speak, or to rest, or to dream. It was simply that such things had no place here. Words could not alter stone. Rest could not restore what had been worn away. Dreams offered no escape when waking meant returning to the same tunnel, the same burden, the same cold taste of salt in the back of the throat. And so the men became quieter, duller, their movements reduced to habit, their minds folded inward upon themselves. The young rarely lasted long. Their bodies, while strong, lacked the scar tissue of endurance, the hardened hands and knees and lungs needed to survive the mind's slow unraveling. They came with ambition or desperation, or sometimes simply hunger, and they left with nothing, not even stories. Sometimes they vanished between shifts, slipping away in the dark with boots in hand and breath held tight, hoping to disappear into the hills or toward the far villages that lined the rivers to the south. Most were caught. A few were never seen again. And the mine, as always, continued without pause. A place emptied. A new man arrived, and the salt was struck once more. There was no healing in the mine. Wounds did not close cleanly, and bones, once broken, did not set true. The constant dampness, the weight of dust, the strain of labor, it all conspired against recovery. Infection was slow, not dramatic. It came like the salt itself, creeping into the flesh, turning cuts into pits, swelling joints until they could no longer bend. No one cried out. There was no point. There were no doctors, no bandages beyond scraps of old cloth, no medicine but the occasional pinch of something bitter and burned from a crooked bowl by one of the old men who remembered herbs. Most simply worked through the pain until they could not. And when they could not, they were taken to the last room, the small shed behind the main bunkhouse, where those too weak to lift tools lay quietly and waited for their breath to stop. This was not a place of cruelty. No one came to beat them. No one laughed at their suffering. It was a place of silence, of waiting, where the last memories drifted slowly away like smoke from a dying fire. Sometimes another man would sit with them, not to speak, but simply to be present, to acknowledge that they were still there, still men, still something more than hollowed shells. And then they were gone, their cots emptied, their names scratched in the ledger, their boots passed on to the next arrival. Burial was shallow, the ground too hard, the salt always watching. The mind did not mourn. It simply continued. It did not mark time with graves or remember names. Its tunnels wound deeper and deeper into the earth, spreading slowly outward like the veins of some vast, hidden creature. And within those veins, the men moved, slow, steady, fading. Each breath they took was a victory. Each day survived was a defeat deferred. Their bodies, already more salt than flesh, labored not out of hope, but out of inertia. There was no end, only repetition, only the sound of pick on stone, only the breath of the salt, cold and close. And above them, the wind blew over barren ground once more, whistling to the broken trees, carrying with it the scent of dust and damp, the memory of sweat and silence, and the faint, bitter taste of something lost long ago. The trees that once surrounded the mine, real trees, with green leaves that turned gold in autumn and shimmered in the spring wind, had long since given up the struggle to grow. All that remained were pale trunks, stripped bare by years of salt carried on the air like invisible smoke, each one bleached to a ghostly gray-white, their bark cracked, their branches skeletal. They no longer creaked in the wind. They only stood in silence, like sentinels too old to remember what they were guarding. Beneath them, the earth was dry and powdery, crusted with the same residue that clung to the men's skin and lined the corners of their eyes. Rain no longer soaked into the soil here. It hissed on contact, rolling off in small rivulets that pooled briefly and then disappeared into ground, as if swallowed by a thirst too deep to quench. In the distance, far beyond the sightline of the mine and beyond even the paths the traders traveled, the land still lived in places. Villages nestled near rivers, forests thick with leaves, the quiet thrum of insects rising through the trees. But those places existed only in memory now, or in stories so faintly recalled that they no longer carried shape or scent. For the men in the mine, the outside world was a rumor. It had no form, no time. It existed in fragments, a mother's lullaby half remembered, a spring morning one smelled through a cracked window, a voice from long ago that had spoken their name gently. But memory was fragile in this place. It wore away like everything else. Each swing of the pickaxe, each mouthful of salt air, each night spent coughing into a rough blanket, rubbed the sharp edges off their thoughts until they were left with shadows of what once had been. Inside the mind, the salt had moods, or so it seemed. Some days it broke easily, falling away in pale, dry chunks that filled the carts quickly. On others, it refused to give, becoming slick and stubborn, forcing the men to strike the same place over and over again until their arms shook and their breath came in ragged gasps. There were parts of the tunnel that seemed colder than others, where the walls wept moisture and the crystals formed long, dripping fangs that curled downward like icicles. In those sections, men moved more carefully. The salt there seemed to hold sound more closely, to echo even the smallest movement back with sharpness that was almost accusatory, like something listening and waiting to be disturbed. One day, during such a shift, a small collapse occurred near the end of one of the deeper tunnels. No one screamed. No one ran. The cave-ins here were not massive, just sections of ceiling giving way, loosing stones and dust that fell like a sigh. Two men were buried up to their waists, legs pinned beneath heavy slabs of rock and salt. Others came silently, slowly, not with panic, but with the resigned motion of men who had done this before. Picks were used to chip away at the edges of the fallen stone. Carts were repurposed to move debris. The trapped men said nothing. Their eyes were wide, mouths shut tight. Blood soaked slowly into the white dust around them, dark red turning to brown as it mixed with the salt. After an hour, one was freed. The other was not. His ribs had cracked inward. He had stopped breathing long before the last stone was lifted. The men did not look at his face. They covered with cloth, rolled his body into a blanket, and placed him near the tunnel mouth where the night cart would pass. No words were spoken. The work resumed almost immediately. In the shed that night, the cot he once slept on remained empty. No one moved to take it. Not yet. The men had an unspoken rhythm even in that, waiting a night, sometimes two, before claiming the space of the fallen. Some said it was out of respect, others simply out of habit. His boots remained beneath the bed, their laces caked in dust, their soles worn nearly flat. Eventually, someone would wear them. Nothing was wasted here. Not time, not space, not silence. There were times, late at night, when one or two of the men would sit outside the shed, not talking, not watching anything in particular, just sitting on the rough steps or leaning against the salt-stained walls, their faces turned toward the sky. Stars, when they appeared, seemed distant in a way that defied understanding. Not just high, but impossibly far, unreachable even by thought. Looking at them for too long brought a kind of ache. Not physical, but somewhere deep inside the chest, like the faint echo of a name one hadn't heard in years. One man, a thin, wiry figure with a voice like crushed gravel, would sometimes trace constellations with his finger in the air, not naming them, not explaining them, but simply gesturing as if to remind himself that they existed at all. No one stopped him. No one asked him to come back inside. It was the closest thing to prayer any of them had left. And yet, despite all this, the weight of the salt, the silence, the aching joints of forgotten names, no one ever truly left. Not by choice. The mind had a way of holding on to those it had claimed, not with chains or walls, but with something subtler, deeper. Some men had chances to go once or twice. A distant relative who sent money. A foreman who offered a transfer. A gate left unwatched for a night. But almost always, those who left returned within weeks. Thinner, quieter, their eyes hollowed by something worse than what they had left behind. Because outside the mind, the world had changed. Or they had. Either way, they no longer fit into it. The rhythm of freedom was too fast, too bright, too sharp. They missed the silence, the stillness, the certainty. The salt had carved not just their lungs and their hands, but their minds. It had become the only thing they understood. So they stayed and they worked and they waited, not for rescue, not for relief, just for the next breath, the next blow, the next sleep. And when the bell rang again, as it always did, they stood slowly, wearily, and walked back down into the earth, to where the salt waited and the dark closed gently around them once more. There was something almost ceremonial in the way the men descended each day into the darkness of the mine, a kind of wordless ritual built on repetition and surrender, like monks entering a sanctuary not of light and peace, but of shadow and burden. The line of bodies moved steadily, single file down the slope, boots scraping against the salt-stained path, hands trailing the walls as if touching them might tether them to reality. They did not speak. There was no need. Each step was already understood, each breath taken in tandem with the one before and after, every motion synchronized not by command, but by shared fatigue. Their faces were slack, unreadable, not from lack of feeling, but from the deliberate concealment of it, each man having long since learned that pain was best left inside, where it would not distract or infect the others. Eyes stayed forward, shoulders hunched slightly inward. The deeper they went, the quieter they became, until all that remained was the soft creak of cart wheels, the faint clink of metal tools against each other, and the ever-present whisper of salt flaking softly from the ceiling, as if the mine itself were exhaling with them. The air changed subtly as they moved further underground, losing what little freshness it once held, becoming heavier, thicker, until it clung to the lungs like wet wool. The torches, spaced unevenly along the walls, flickered in constant protest, their flames small and stunted, illuminating only what was necessary and leaving everything else to the quiet mercy of darkness. The scent of salt was stronger here, not sharp or clean but old and saturated, mingled with sweat and the faint undertone of rot where the damp gathered in still puddles. It was a scent that did not wash off, no matter how long a man scrubbed. It sank into skin, into cloth, into the very breath one exhaled. Men smelled of salt even when they stood still. They dreamed in salt. They wept tears that burned. Work resumed not at a signal, but at the moment the first pick struck the wall. That sound, always the same and yet always jarring, rang out like the beginning of a chant. A sharp, purposeful crack that broke the stillness, answered almost immediately by other strikes, other hands, other bodies falling into motion. And then, once again, the rhythm resumed, one that had neither beginning nor end, only the endless beat of tools against stone, the scrape of sacks being dragged over the uneven ground, the occasional grunt or cough that punctuated the silence like punctuation marks in otherwise featureless sentence. Each man knew his section. Each man knew his role. It was a kind of order born not from structure, but from inevitability. There was no overseer here, not in these deeper tunnels. The mind governed itself, and its laws were written in bruises and exhaustion. On this particular day, there was a small fire in one of the higher shafts, where the walls had dried too quickly, and a spark from a drop tool caught a strip of brittle cloth used to pad the stones. The flames were not large, and they did not spread far, but the smoke filled the tunnel quickly, curling down the narrow shaft and drifting like a silent predator into the main corridor. The men did not panic. They moved with the same resigned urgency they brought to all things, efficient, unhurried, focused. Wet cloths were pressed to mouths, buckets filled and passed hand to hand, the flames smothered beneath thick layers of damp salt. When the last embers were gone, no one spoke. They simply resumed the work, as if the interruption had been a mere pause in the day's breath. One man, however, did not return to his tunnel. His name was Eli, though few remembered it. He had come to mind years ago, his past never discussed, his presence as accepted as any other. On this day, the smoke had been too much for him. His lungs, already weak from years of salt dust, had failed. He had collapsed not in panic, but in silence, his body folding inward like parchment left too long in the rain. When the others found him, he was still breathing, barely, but his lips had turned blue and his eyes, though open, seemed to be looking through the stone, not at it. He was carried to the surface without ceremony, placed in a small shed where the dying waited, and left beneath a threadbare blanket that no longer offered warmth. The others returned to work. No one asked what would happen next. They already knew. Above ground, the sky hung low and pale, the clouds unmoving, the wind dry and indifferent. The few animals that once wandered near the mine were long gone, their absence as unnoticed as their arrival. Only the crows remained, circling far overhead, black specks against the monotony of the sky. They did not land. Even they seemed unwilling to come too close. The buildings creaked softly in the breeze, their timbers swollen and bent from years of exposure, their windows clouded with the dust of 100 forgotten storms. Nothing here aged cleanly. It all wore away in layers, until even the nails in the walls seemed to forget why they had been placed there. The men who worked the afternoon shift emerged one by one from the sheds, slower than those before them, their steps cautious, as if afraid the ground might give way beneath them. Their eyes were sunken, their skin dry and thin, drawn tight over bones that no longer seemed strong enough to carry them. Some limped, some coughed. All moved with the same quiet determination, not out of strength, but out of habit. This was their place. This was their life. The salt did not allow for alternatives. It merely existed, and they existed within it. Eli passed before the bell rang again. The breath simply stopped. There was no sound, no final word. His chest fell and did not rise. One of the older men covered his face and sat beside the body until the foreman came. No questions were asked, no documentation required. A space was cleared near the others who had gone before, and the body was buried that night. The grave shallow, the earth reluctant to yield even for the dead. A wooden marker was placed above him, but the name carved into it had already begun to fade. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, not in color but in shadow, the mine waited. The bell rang, and once more the line of men began its descent, boots scraping stone, shoulders hunched, faces blank, the rhythm resuming as though it had never paused. Down again, the boots dragged against the stone like echoes of ghosts returning to places they never left, each footstep as predictable as it was resigned. The line of men, dulled by repetition and the numbing silence of memory, moved as if drawn by gravity, not only of the earth but of obligation, of something heavier than stone pressing down upon their spines and shoulders with a weight so constant it had long since ceased to feel like burden and instead became the only sensation left. The torches burned low in their brackets, the flames curling weakly against the thick, salted air, casting shadows that flickered like half-formed thoughts against the crusted walls. The salt in these deeper levels clung to everything, tools, breath, eyelids, and its taste filled the mouth even without eating, a cold bitterness that coated the tongue and nestled into the throat like sand in a wound. This time, the mind felt different, not in shape or color or sound, for those things never change, but in something less visible, an undercurrent, like the mood of a house when something has gone wrong, though no one yet knows what it is. The tunnels held their silence more tightly than usual, as if hoarding it, and the men, sensing this, said even less than they normally did, their movements more careful, their tools lifted with a stiffness that had nothing to do with muscle or pain. In the narrow passageways, the dust rose like smoke, fine and persistent, and with every breath, it entered their lungs a dry, insidious guest that never left. Among them was Tomas, whose name was remembered not because he was remarkable, but because he was still young, too young to be buried beneath salt, some whispered, and because, despite all odds, he still moved with a hint of uprightness in his back and some trace of light behind his eyes, as if part of him had not yet accepted the mine's final terms. He had arrived only months before, sent by a family that needed fewer mouths to feed, with promises of wages and a place to sleep. At first, he had asked questions. Why the men didn't talk, why the salt smelled sweet at times, bitter at others, why the tunnel at the far end was always avoided. But the answers never came, and slowly, like cloth soaking in brine, he had grown quieter, the edges of his curiosity frayed into weariness. Today, he worked in a long tunnel called a hollow vein, a place where the salt formed in delicate crystalline sheets that shattered like glass when struck. The shards were sharp and dry, like slivers of bone, and they cut through gloves and flesh with the same silent ease. He had been assigned here after another man, whose name had already been half forgotten, fell and split his head against the wall. No one had cleaned the stain. Tomas now worked just a few paces from it, careful not to glance toward the dark streak that crept upward like the mark of something trying to rise. His pick was lighter than the others, the handle smoother, the head chipped at the corner. It made a different sound when it struck the salt, a thinner crack, higher pitched, like the echo of a voice heard underwater. Tomas worked steadily, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The skin raw from salt rash, his knuckles reddened and split. Every few minutes, he paused to stretch his back, which ached not from strain but from the cold that seemed to settle in his bones the moment he entered the mine. Around him, the others continued without pause, each locked into his own pattern of movement, their faces expressionless, their eyes dull. Somewhere nearby, a cart was squealed, its axle bent, the sound cutting through the tunnel like a scream quickly swallowed. Tomas flinched. It was rare to hear anything so sharp in the mine. Sound usually came rounded and soft, absorbed by the thick, dusty air. But this screech was like something from above ground, from a world of metal and movement and things that worked. He turned briefly, to see the cart, pushed by a man he didn't know, perhaps knew, perhaps simply unfamiliar from distance. The man did not meet his eyes. No one did. Hours passed like that, or what felt like hours, though time in the mine had no structure, no measure. It passed in cycles of work and pause, breath and cough, pick and drag. Lunch came, or something like it, a strip of dried meat, a hunk of old bread, a flask of water so bitter it seemed thick. Tomas sat on an overturned bucket to eat, his back against the wall, the salt scraping at his shirt. He did not speak. No one around him did. The only sounds were the chewing, the occasional sniffle, the shifting of bodies trying to find comfort on the hard ground. There were no fires in the mine, no warmth, only the closeness of stone and breath. When the break ended, they stood slowly, not out of reluctance, but because standing too quickly often brought dizziness, and fainting here meant falling, and falling meant being left where you landed until shift's end. Tomas returned to the wall, his pick raised, his breath steady. The crystals in this part of the tunnel were beautiful in a way that no one mentioned. They caught the torchlight in soft flashes like ice or polished glass, and for a moment, as he swung, he imagined what they might look like if carved into something. An ornament, a ring, a keepsake. The thought passed quickly, dismissed as dangerous. Beauty did not belong here. To notice it was to open oneself to the pain of its loss. And then the pick slipped. The shard of salt broke not cleanly but jagged, and a sliver of it shot upward, striking his cheek just below the eye. He recoiled slightly, instinctively covering the wound with one hand. The sting immediate, the warmth of blood unfamiliar in this cold place. It wasn't deep, just sharp, but the sensation was jarring, not because of the pain, but because it reminded him, suddenly, overwhelmingly, that he was still made of flesh, that beneath the layers of salt, beneath the grime and the silence, there was still something soft, something vulnerable, something human. He wiped the blood away with his sleeve, the fabric stiff with old sweat, and resumed his work. The salt did not pause. The others did not look. The tunnel stretched before him, the same as it ever was, and above him, somewhere far beyond reach, the world continued turning. The blood dried slowly on Tomas's cheek, caking in a thin, reddish streak that stretched from just below his eye to the line of his jaw, where it merged with the dried salt that already clung to his skin in thick, scaly patches. It did not hurt much, not anymore. The sting had dulled into warmth, then faded entirely, and soon he could not feel it at all, just as he no longer truly felt his fingers as he gripped the pick, or the weight of the leather strap that hung heavy across his shoulder, or even the ache in his knees which had been constant since his second week in the mine. Pain was like everything else here. Unremarkable, routine, a steady companion whose voice became so familiar that its presence no longer needed acknowledging. The men did not check their injuries unless something refused to stop bleeding, and even then, they wrapped it quickly, clumsily, with the edge of a shirt or the corner of a rag, and got back to work before the foreman noticed a delay. The rhythm resumed. Swing, breathe, drag, cough, repeat. The salt broke away from the wall in pieces, some small and sharp, others thick and heavy. It fell with a soft, dry sound, like bones settling in an old grave. Each piece was gathered and packed carefully, dropped into the wooden cart that stood a few feet behind Tomas, its wheels locked in place by stones and habit. The cart itself groaned when filled, the boards creaking under the weight, but no one checked for splits or weakness. When the cart broke, it was replaced. When a man broke, he was not. That was the difference. In the tunnel beside Tomas, an older man named Corwin worked in silence. His back bent so sharply from years in the mine that he seemed to curve naturally into the wall as he chipped away at it. His beard, once thick and dark, had turned brittle and gray, speckled with salt that clung like snow. His eyes were nearly always half-lidded, not with sleep, but with caution, shielding them from the dust that rained constantly from above like dry mist. He wore the same coat every day, patched at the elbows with pieces of an old sack, and he moved with a kind of practiced precision, never hasty, never slow. Tomas had spoken to him once, early on, when he'd first arrived. Corwin hadn't answered, only looked at him for a long moment before turning back to the wall. Tomas had never tried again. Now, they worked only a few feet apart, their picks rising and falling in a rhythm almost musical in its sameness, the silence between them broken only by the occasional grunt or the soft thump of falling salt. Neither man looked at the other. They didn't need to, in the mine. Companionship was not forged with words or shared memories, but with labor, side by side, day after day, the bond of presence alone enough to become something close to trust. Tomas did not know Corwin's story, did not know where he had come from, whether he had family, whether he had always been like this, but he had seen the man weep once very quietly, while working a stubborn seam of salt that would not break. The tears came silently, and Corwin didn't stop chipping. They mixed with the dust on his cheeks and vanished. That was how grief worked here. It did not demand attention. It did not seek comfort. It simply moved through the body like cold, and then it was gone. The cart filled slowly. The salt in this section was denser, more tangled with stone, requiring more effort to remove. Tomas's hands ached, the skin across his knuckles splitting again, small threads of blood mixing with the grime. He wiped them absently on his shirt, leaving dark smears that joined dozens of others. The torch above him sputtered, flickering weakly as the air thickened. It was always worse down this far. Less circulation, less light, less of everything. The shadows were deeper here, and the salt grew in odd shapes. Twisted spirals, jagged flares, strange bubbles that cracked when touched. Some men said it was cursed salt, that it grew near the buried tunnels where entire crews had once vanished, swallowed by cave-in so total that even their names had been erased from the ledger. Others said it was the best salt, rich, old, full of the earth's strength. Tomas had no opinion. He broke it because it was his job to break it, not because it meant anything. Far behind him, the faint sound of coughing echoed down the tunnel, bouncing gently off the walls. It was a deep, wet cough, one that belonged to old Vesnik, a man who had been in the mine longer than anyone else still alive, and whose body now moved more from memory than strength. Vesnik hadn't spoken in weeks, perhaps months. Some said he'd gone deaf. Others said he just didn't see the point. He worked each day with a slow determination, and when he was too tired to continue, he sat against the wall and closed his eyes, and the next day he was there again, always in the same spot. They said the mine would take him sitting up, his pick still resting across his knees, eyes shut as if in prayer. Tomas sometimes wondered if he would become like that. If, given time, he too would forget what it felt like to hear his name spoken aloud, or see the sky without coughing, or to hold a piece of bread without it tasting of dust. He wondered if one day's reflection would surprise him, if he'd see his own face in a patch of clear water and not recognize what looked back. The salt aged them all, not with years, but with erosion. It didn't mark them slowly. It wore them down at the edges until their shapes changed, until they were no longer who they had been, but something less specific, less defined. Just men, just hands, just shadows with picks. When the cart was full, Tomas stood back and wiped his brow again, the sleeve scraping against the scrape on his cheek. It burned faintly, but he ignored it. He reached for the harness. Thick, stiff leather that bit into the shoulder when tightened, and began to drag the load toward the tunnel mouth. It was heavy, and the wheels jerked unevenly over the worn tracks, sending vibrations up his arms with each jolt. Behind him, Corwin continued to chip unbothered, his own cart only half full. Tomas did not speak. No one helped. That was not how it worked. The light grew marginally stronger as he moved up the tunnel, though it never became bright. It only shifted from total dimness to a kind of grim haze, the torches burning slightly steadier in this section, the air a little easier to breathe. Still, each step felt like a climb, each breath like inhaling through cloth soaked in brine. When he reached the turn where the tunnels met, he paused, resting for just a moment, hands on his knees, the cart groaning behind him. Ahead, the corridor stretched on in familiar silence, its walls lined with crates and ropes and the rusting remains of old tools long since abandoned. The mine felt larger here and yet more enclosed, as if it were not a place but presence, watching, waiting, measuring the worth of those inside it one breath at a time. He straightened, took hold of the cart again, and moved forward. Behind him, the tunnel swallowed the sound of his footsteps. The wheels of the cart rolled reluctantly now, one of them beginning to wobble from the uneven load, its iron rim scraping against the track with a sound like grinding teeth, low and steady and unpleasant. Tomas ignored it. He kept his hands firmly on the wooden handles, shoulders drawn inward as he leaned into the weight. The cart had grown heavier, not only from the salt it carried, but from the accumulation of dust and fatigue, from the way every movement in the mine seemed to resist the men who made it. Even the air, dense with moisture and trace salt, pushed back against their chests, turning each breath into a slow negotiation. He moved forward to the corridor, following the flicker of distant torchlight. knowing exactly where to turn, how many steps before the floor dipped slightly, where the ceiling narrowed. He did not think about these things. His body remembered them better than his mind did now. The passage widened just before the sorting room, though calling it a room was generous. It was a natural chamber unevenly shaped, with one corner collapsing on itself, and the other framed by a wooden shelf built decades ago to hold the crude tally board. The board itself was streaked with soot and fingerprints, lines scratched hastily in chalk beside names long rubbed away. Each cart was brought here first, paused in front of the board, the weight guessed roughly by the foreman or whoever stood in his place. The count added to the day's record with no more than a passing glance. If the cart was full enough, no questions were asked. If it wasn't, the man might be sent back down, no matter how tired or bloodied he was. Quantity was survival, not for the men, for the mine. Today, the chamber was quieter than usual. The man at the board, a gaunt figure with pale lips and a back that no longer straightened fully, said nothing as Tomas approached. He barely looked up, only scratched a mark into the board and gestured with 2 fingers toward the sidetrack. That meant the load was to go to the brining shed, an area where the coarser chunks of salt would be soaked, softened, and eventually dried again into blocks for trade. Tomas gave a slight nod, barely perceptible, and turned the car along the creaking rail toward the far end of the chamber, where the tunnel dipped again into dampness. He passed 2 other men on their way out, neither of whom met his eye, and moved into the brining area, where the air grew colder and thicker. Water pooled in shallow stone basins, brown-edged and always shifting, stirred not by movement but by the tremble of distant machinery and the settling of the ground. Ropes hung from overhead beams, their ends crusted with salt, and the sound of dripping water was constant here, echoing off the curved ceiling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The cart wheels splashed as he moved, and the salt within hissed faintly as the moisture reached it. This was normal. It always did that. A whispering sound, like steam but dry, as if the salt were protesting its change of state. He unloaded the cart by hand, 1 piece at a time, each chunk of salt cold and heavy and rough against his palms. The stone scraped his fingers raw, reopened the small wounds already marked across his skin. He did not flinch. The pain was familiar now, as much a part of the process as the lifting and the stacking. Occasionally a chunk would slip, landing with a splash or a clatter. No one reacted. The brining room was manned only by the quietest workers, men too injured or too old to haul carts, but still able to carry, to lift, to place. They moved like ghosts between the basins, their feet bare, the soles of their skin gray and cracked, their hands wrapped in rags. No one spoke. No one needed to. Each man knew his task. Each man knew where not to step. When the cart was empty, Tomas wiped his hands against his trousers, leaving streaks of blood and brine behind. He turned without a word and left the chamber, his boots squelching faintly against the wet stone, and made his way back along the passage, back to the tunnel where the torches still flickered, back toward the darkness that waited for his return. His shift was not over. Not yet. There were still hours to be filled, carts to be loaded, salt to be broken. Rest was something that came only in pieces, and rarely on time. Back at his station, Corwin was gone. In his place stood a new man, thin, hunched, unfamiliar, his hands moving uncertainly against the salt, his pick swinging too wide, too fast. Tomas watched for a moment, then stepped past him, further down the tunnel to where a fresh seam had been marked with chalk. He took up his pick again. The stone greeted him with silence, as always, and the rhythm returned. Swing, chip, lift, repeat. No one said where Corwin had gone. No one asked. Perhaps he'd been moved to another tunnel. Perhaps he'd finally collapsed and been left to rest in the shed. Or perhaps, like so many others, he had simply vanished into the folds of the mine, folded into the same silence that swallowed all things here, one breath at a time. Tomas did not think about it long. There was no room for such thoughts. They cluttered the mind. They slowed the hands. And in the mine, slowness was dangerous. It drew attention. It marked a man as weak. A torch snapped suddenly overhead, the flame jumping, then dimming, and for a moment the tunnel seemed to pulse with darkness before the light returned. The walls pressed closer, or seemed to, and Tomas paused, listening. Not to any sound, but to the quiet itself, to the way the salt sometimes shifted beneath the surface, to the way the ground sighed as if turning in sleep. Then, with no further sign, he resumed his work. The tunnel breathed with him. And so, as another cart began its slow roll toward the sorting room, as the brining shed filled with dripping salt and gray hands, as the board was marked once more with chalk and dust, the mine continued, unchanged, unforgiving, eternal. The hours passed without any clear measure, blurring together in the dimness, as though time itself dissolved inside the salt. The torches burned lower, their oil sputtering quietly as the flames wavered in protest against the stagnant air, casting jittery shadows along the uneven walls. In this place, there were no clocks, no chimes, no breaks marked by bells. The day ended not because it had reached a particular hour, but because the body finally could no longer lift or swing or pull. The men learned to read their limits through sensation alone, the heaviness of limbs, the ache deep in the hips and wrists, the burning in the lungs when air refused to come easily. When that heaviness overtook all else, it was understood that it was time to stop, not for relief, but for recovery enough to begin again. Tomas moved slowly now, the fire in his shoulders dulled to a thick, pulsing weight, his fingers stinging with each grip of the pick. He had been working the same seam for what felt like hours. The salt here harder, denser, its veins woven tightly around streaks of darker mineral that made it brittle and unpredictable. When struck just wrong, it splintered violently, throwing shards across the tunnel. A sliver had lodged itself in his arm earlier, just beneath the sleeve, and though he had pulled it free, the wound continued to throb. He had not looked at it since. Looking only made things worse. Better to keep moving, to trust that nothing too essential had been damaged. The rest of the tunnel had emptied slowly, one man at a time slipping back toward the surface, each choosing his own moment to stop. Tomas remained. He often stayed later than the others, not because he wanted to prove anything, not because he hoped for recognition or extra coin, but simply because the quiet felt deeper when he was alone. The mine without voices, without footfalls, without the soft rhythm of others laboring beside him, took on a stillness that was almost sacred in its weight. It pressed against him not with threat, but with intimacy. It became a companion, vast and present, not cruel but indifferent, which somehow felt easier to bear than the forced companionship of the others. There was no judgment in the stone, only permanence. He struck again, this time with more force, the pickhead cracking into the seam and sending a line of salt splintering across the wall in a jagged white fracture. It felt satisfying, though it offered little yield. He paused, letting his breathing steady, and leaned against the shaft of the tool, his head bowed, the heat of his breath rising slowly into the chill. The silence around him was complete now. No voices, no carts, no distant hammering. Just a low hum of the mine itself, that soft, almost imperceptible drone that lived somewhere between hearing and imagination, as if the salt whispered in a voice so old it had forgotten words. He closed his eyes. It was then that he felt it, a change in the air, subtle but unmistakable, a movement that was not wind. For wind could not reach this far, but a shift, a pull, as though the very tunnel had exhaled. It was not threatening. It was not even loud. But it was real. His eyes opened again slowly, adjusting once more to the gloom. The walls looked unchanged. The salt still gleamed dully beneath the torchlight. The shadows still crouched in their corners. Yet something felt closer. Something he could not name. Tomas stood upright, slowly, and took a step back from the wall, his boots crunching against the scattered flakes of salt on the floor. He did not turn around. There was no sound behind him, but he felt it, the weight of attention. Not a presence exactly, but a pressure, as if the mind itself had taken notice of him for the first time, not as a shape among others, but as a distinct figure alone in the dark. His throat felt dry, though he had not spoken. His hands tightened instinctively around the shaft of the pick. And then it was gone. Whatever had shifted, whatever had pressed inward, receded. The tunnel resumed its silence. The salt resumed its stillness. The whisper at the edge of hearing was once again too faint to hold on to. He let out a slow breath and sat down on a low stone shelf carved naturally into the wall, a place where others had sat before him. He could see the faint smoothness worn into the edge from countless shoulders, countless pauses just like this. His heartbeat slowed. The strangeness passed, but he did not return to work. Instead, He rested his head against the wall, the salt cool against his temple, and allowed himself to drift, not into sleep, not yet, but into something softer, a kind of half-waking where the rhythm of the mind became something more than background. He could hear it now not as silence, but as texture, the distant drip of water in the brining pools, the crackle of a dying torch, the occasional hiss of shifting salt as it settled deeper in the tunnels. He listened, not because there was anything to learn, but because it reminded him that the mind was always moving, always breathing, always watching. Time passed, perhaps an hour, perhaps only minutes. But when Tomas stirred again, his body reminded him of every joint, every bruise, every place where skin had split. He stood stiffly and without much thought gathered his things. He did not look at the salt he had broken. He did not collect it. The cart was still back in the brining room, emptied and waiting. He would retrieve it later, or someone else would. It didn't matter. Not now. He made his way back to the tunnel, walking slowly, his boots dragging slightly with each step, the edges of his vision blurred by exhaustion. The torches he passed barely lit his path now, and in places the dark pressed tightly around him, but he did not fear it. The darkness in the mind was not empty. It was full of knowing. It recognized him, and he, in turn, had come to recognize it. Not as enemy, not as friend, but as something ancient and constant and unmoved by the frailty of men. At the tunnel's mouth, where the slope began to rise toward the surface, Tomas paused again, just for a moment, and looked back. There was nothing to see, only shadows, only stone. But he watched anyway, as if expecting something to emerge from the dark, some shape that followed him without footsteps. Nothing did. He turned and began to climb. Each step upward felt like an unfamiliar motion, as though he were moving in a direction his body no longer remembered how to trust. The weight of the mind clung to him, not physically, but in the slowing of thought, the stiffness of breath, the deep-rooted certainty that what waited above was not relief, but merely a different kind of burden. And yet he climbed, because that was what the body did when the shift ended. It rose. It reached. It left behind the darkness, only to return to it again tomorrow. The surface was no less grim than the tunnels below, just colder, sharper around the edges, where the wind moved more freely and the gray sky seemed fixed in its dreariness, unchanging across the long days and longer seasons. Tomas emerged into that dull afternoon light, not with relief, but with the same resignation he carried each time he left the mine, his breath visible now as it drifted slowly from his mouth and vanished into the air like smoke. The cold bit at the thin fabric of his sleeves, stung at the cuts on his hands, and tugged at the dampness in his boots. But he did not flinch, after the salt air, after the choking stillness of the tunnels. Even pain felt like clarity. He blinked a few times, eyes adjusting not to brightness. There was none, but at the openness of the world above, where the weight of stone had lifted, even if only temporarily. Around him, the outbuildings stood in quiet ruin, sheds with sagging roofs and walls bowed inward from years of dampness and frost, their doors always ajar, their windows forever coated in grime. Everything here had a softness to it, but not a comforting kind. Rather, the softness aware of erosion, of structure giving way slowly to time and neglect. The pathways between the buildings were little more than hardened ruts carved into the dirt by years of boots and carts. Salt dust clung to everything, forming pale crusts on the wood, on the stones, on the very grass that dared to grow near the edges of the compound. It was inescapable. Even the air carried it, so that breathing deeply left the mouth tasting faintly of bitterness and the nose stinging with invisible crystals. Other men emerged from the shafts, one at a time or in small, silent pairs, none speaking, none looking up. Each moved in the same direction, toward a long, low dormitory that stood at the edge of the yard, its walls patched with mismatched planks and its narrow chimney coughing faint wisps of smoke into the cold sky. Inside, the stove would be lit, not for comfort, but to keep the worst of the frost from settling into the men's joints while they slept. The heat never reached the far corners. Blankets were thin, and the straw in the bunks was rarely changed, flattened over time into something like felt, scratchy and warm in patches, but full of grit and old sweat. Still, it was enough. It had to be. Tomas moved slowly toward the building, his footsteps dragging slightly through the ruts in the ground. His limbs felt heavy now, not with exhaustion exactly, but with the deep, dull inertia that came after long work, when the body no longer sought rest but simply ceased to argue. The door creaked open under his hand, its rusted hinge protesting the weight, and the smell inside greeted him. Old with smoke, damp clothes, salt, and the faint sweetness of rot where mold had crept into the corners. A few men sat near the stove, hunched and quiet, their hands extended toward the coals not to warm but to feel something. The flames flickered dimly behind a cracked iron grate, and the light cast strange shapes along the floorboards. He crossed to his bunk in silence, stepping around the scattered boots and blankets, and sat down heavily. The straw beneath him sighed with the pressure, releasing a puff of dust that shimmered briefly in the stove's glow before vanishing. He pulled off his boots with slow, deliberate effort, grimacing as the leather tugged his raw ankles, and then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. His face felt dry and tight, the wound on his cheek beginning to itch, though he resisted the urge to touch it. The salt would have already crept into it, he knew, already begun its quiet work of burning and sealing. The body adapted in strange ways. Cuts did not fester here. They closed hard and fast, as if even the blood had learned to become stone. Around him, the other men prepared for rest in their own ways. One cleaned a tool in silence, another rubbed oil into his wrists, another stared blankly at a spot on the floor where a water stain had taken the shape of something almost like a bird. No one laughed. No one spoke more than a whisper. Conversation was a thing that happened elsewhere, in other worlds. Here, sound was used sparingly, as if words might wear out as easily as boots. The stove crackled softly. The wind moaned against the boards outside. And one by one, the men began to lie down, pulling threadbare covers over their chests, their eyes drifting closed not with peace, but with necessity. Tomas did not lie down. Not yet. He remained seated, eyes half closed, the weight of the day still pressing into him like stone. His thoughts did not wander far. They never did anymore, but hovered close, repeating the same shapes. The way the tunnel had breathed today, the cold press of salt against his cheek, the silence that had seemed to watch him from the dark. He did not fear the mind. That was not the right word. But he had come to understand it, in the way one understands a storm or a slow illness. It moved through him. It changed him. It did not ask permission. Eventually, he leaned back, shoulders pressed against a rough wall, the smell of smoke curling around him like fog. His eyes closed fully then, and for a time there was no mind, no salt, no pain. Only the rhythm of breath, the creak of the roof beams, and the soft, slow ticking of something. Perhaps a pipe, perhaps a memory, somewhere just beyond the edge of sleep. And still the salt waited. It was never far. Not in the sting beneath his fingernails. Not in the dried blood on his sleeve. Not in the thin, gritty taste that coated his mouth. Even now, in the quiet of evening, it waited with the patience of centuries, knowing that tomorrow the carts would roll again, the picks would rise, and the men would return as they always did, as they always would, until there was nothing left of them to give. But for now it was still. The mind rested, the men rested, and the darkness deepened outside, pulling the wind across the roof in long, lonesome sighs, like breath drawn slowly from a body too tired to speak. Morning did not arrive with brightness or birdsong or any welcome sense of renewal. For in this place, morning was not an event but a gradual emergence from the gray, an imperceptible shift from one dimness to another, marked only by the stiff creaking of old bodies rising from straw beds and the dull shuffle of boots across a cold wooden floor. There was no sun visible through the crooked windows, only a faint suggestion of light pressing weakly through the grime-streaked glass, casting long shadows that moved only when the stove was stirred or a man passed by on his way to the wash basin. The room smelled of sleep and salt and worn wool, of old wounds and unspoken dreams that had been slowly bled out into the fabric of blankets and the cracked planks beneath them. Tomas opened his eyes not because he felt rested, but because the weight of staying asleep had become greater than the weight of rising. His limbs protested as he moved, the soreness deep in his joints like something settled there permanently, as if it belonged to bones themselves. His hands, when he looked at them, were stiff and red, the fingers slightly curled from the cold, the skin across the knuckles flaking and raw where salt and labor had worn it down layer by layer. He flexed them slowly, then push himself upright, his breath visible again in the faint morning air, curling softly before dissolving into the space between bunks. Around him, the other men rose in near silence, each one wrapped in his own thoughts, or perhaps too empty of thought to form words. There was no rush, but also no delay. The rhythm of waking was as well rehearsed as the rhythm of work, and each movement, from slipping on worn socks to tightening a belt around sunken hips, had been done so many times it no longer required attention. They moved like clockwork, not in perfect synchrony, but in the steady, inevitable way that clocks move forward, ticks and tocks, breaths and steps, without question or variation. Outside, the wind had not softened overnight. It scraped gently at the walls of the dormitory, carrying with it the dry hiss of salt carried on a breeze from the nearby storage piles, where mountains of harvested crystals lay beneath rough canvas covers, waiting to be loaded and traded and ground into finer forms. The wind did not howl. It sighed, and in that sigh was a memory of every man who had passed through this place, of every cart that had ever rolled from the mine to the scale, of every back that had bent beneath a burden too great to carry, and yet carried anyway. Tomas made his way to the wash basin, its metal surface rimmed with rust and ringed with frozen drips of water that had solidified overnight into jagged lines. The water inside was so cold it burned. He splashed it on his face without flinching, rubbing at the dry blood still clinging to his cheek, now scabbed over and pale. The salt had begun to harden around the edges of the wound, drawing the skin tight in a way that would leave a scar if it had the time to heal. He did not dry his face, only let the water run down and drip from his chin, mingling with the dampness already on his collar. Behind him, another man stepped up, and Tomas stepped aside, their shoulders brushing without acknowledgement. Breakfast was no more than a gesture, a thin porridge, gritty and sour, ladled into wooden bowls by a cook who never smiled and rarely spoke. The room where they ate was scarcely warmer than the one where they slept, and the benches wobbled as men sat in lines, their heads bowed over their food, not in prayer, but in necessity. They ate quickly, without conversation, the sound of spoons scraping against was the only music. No one lingered when the bowls were emptied. Hunger was never truly sated here. It was dulled for a time, but it returned with the same regularity as the shifts, as the carts, as the pain. And so they rose again, one by one, filing out into the chill morning air, their breaths puffing visibly as they made their way toward the entrance of the mine. No one needed to be called. No one waited for orders. The mine did not demand with voice or sign. Its presence alone was enough. It summoned by its very existence, by the way it loomed in the background, dark and gaping, a constant reminder of what waited below. There was no gate, no barrier, just a path worn deep by decades of footsteps, leading from the dormitory to the mouth of the earth. Tomas followed the others in silence, his steps measured, his gaze on the ground. Around him, the buildings huddled against the wind, their roofs trembling, their windows dull and clouded. The mine entrance grew larger as they approached, its blackness absolute, swallowing light rather than reflecting it, as if it were not an opening but a wound. The wooden supports around it had been replaced recently, one of the few improvements made in recent memory. But even these beams had already begun to warp and darken under the weight of salt and time. A lantern hung above the threshold, its flame flickering weakly inside a glass cage, offering little light and less comfort. He stepped inside. The descent began as it always did, with the shift in air, the sudden change in pressure that made the ears pop faintly and the lungs feel heavier, as though each breath were drawn through a layer of gauze. The steps beneath his boots turned from frost-covered stone to smoother, darker rock, damp and slick in patches where the water seeped through unseen veins. The light from the entrance faded quickly behind him, and ahead, only the occasional torch lit the path, their flames dimmer than those above, as if the salt itself muted fire as it did sound. By the time he reached the lower tunnels, the outside world had vanished entirely. The mine had reclaimed him. The lower levels of the mine were not carved by design so much as they were revealed by persistence, dug out not according to plans or maps, but by the relentless hunger for salt that pressed men deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth with each passing year. Tunnels branched in crooked lines, some narrow enough that a man could barely turn within them, others opening into chambers that breathed with stale air and the silent memory of collapses long past. Signs were rare, and those that existed had long since faded into illegibility. Wooden plaques blackened by smoke and time. Chalk markings washed away by damp. Rusted nails hanging alone where instructions had once been posted. The mind did not welcome. It accepted. Tomas stepped carefully now, though not fearfully, his body remembering the slight tilt of the passage underfoot, the places where the stone gave just a little, where the floor was damp and where it was dry. He passed alcoves filled with old tools, broken picks, splinter handles, ropes gone stiff with salt, and kept moving deeper into the section where the most recent veins had been uncovered. The torches burned more dimly here, and some tunnels had none at all, requiring workers to carry small lanterns or else rely on the faint glow that filtered to the salt itself in patches, like pale ghosts pressing outward from within the walls. He did not carry a lantern. He knew this path. It had become as much a part of his body as the scars on his hands or the weight in his spine. He could navigate it by feel, by instinct, by the faint vibrations in the air and the patterns of shadow across the walls. This was the mind's true silence. Not the absence of noise, but the full presence of stillness, complete and immovable, a silence that swallowed even thought if one lingered too long. It was not cruel. It was complete, and Tomas, like the others, had long ago surrendered to it. He reached the seam, a patch of salt marked days earlier with a faint white X, just at shoulder height, where the stones shimmered with a strange translucence, almost as if lit from within. The salt here was different. It cracked more sharply, came away in larger sheets, but it also stung more, its dust finer, its taste more bitter. Some said it was older salt, pulled from deeper layers of the earth, closer to the mineral's origin, more potent, more powerful. Others said it was simply dangerous. Too dry, too sharp, the kind that left men coughing blood and rubbing their eyes raw for days. Tomas didn't speculate. He did what the mark told him to do. His pick moved slowly at first, each swing measured, the rhythm of impact and recoil steady and sure. The salt fractured under his touch with sound like breaking glass, sending slivers spinning off into the dark, where they vanished without a trace. The larger sheets fell away with a dull thud, piling at his feet in uneven stacks that caught the torchlight in jagged reflections. Each strike sent a shudder through his arm, up into his shoulder, deep into his ribs. It hurt, but hurt was just a reminder of life, of effort, of reality. He paused once, not from exhaustion but from the weight of the air, which seemed thicker today, more oppressive. The torch behind him flickered, dimmed slightly, then returned, and for a moment he felt as if something had moved at the edge of his vision, just beyond the torchlight, just beyond the reach of certainty. But when he turned, there was nothing, only the tunnel stretching back into darkness. Only the mind. It was easy to imagine things down here. Shapes, sounds, faces in the salt. Tomas had seen them all. He did not speak of it, not to the others, not even to himself. To speak of the mind's ghosts was to grant them form, and form was dangerous. The mind needed boundaries in this place. It needed anchors. He turned back to the seam and kept working, the pick rising and falling with renewed purpose, his breath shallow now, his hands bleeding slightly from reopened cuts that he barely noticed. Time passed without measure. At some point, he became aware of a sound, a low, steady groan from somewhere in the tunnel behind him, not quite mechanical, not quite natural. A shifting, a weight settling, the mind breathing, perhaps. It was not alarming. It was simply there, a reminder that the earth was never still, that the structure above and below him was never fixed, but always in motion, creeping, sagging, closing. The salt held secrets, they said. Entire tunnels lost to time. Rooms sealed by collapses so complete that even sound could not escape. Sometimes men working alone in distant shafts claimed to hear knocking, faint, deliberate, as if someone trapped long ago still sought release. But when they searched, they found only walls, only silence. Tomas had never heard the knocking. But now, as he worked deeper into the seam, as the salt gave way in larger and larger chunks, he found himself wondering what lay beyond it. Not metaphorically, but truly, what space waited on the other side of this thinning barrier, what air had been trapped there for centuries, what emptiness might open if the salt finally gave way. The pick struck again, and the wall cracked. Not dangerously, but with promise. Another strike, and a fist-sized piece came free, revealing not blackness, but a kind of dull shimmer beyond, as if the salt continued, unbroken, into some deeper chamber. He reached for the lantern someone had left behind on a nearby crate, and held it close, its glow weak, but enough to show the scene clearly now, the hairline fractures running like veins through the wall. He leaned in, pressed his hand against the surface. It was warm. That was strange. The mine was always cold. Even in its deepest sections, the air was sharp and damp, the stone chilled to the touch. But this salt, this wall, it radiated a faint, undeniable warmth like breath against skin. He withdrew his hand, unsettled not by fear, but by something more subtle, something like reverence, as if he had found something that was not meant to be found. He sat back on his heels, the lantern resting beside him, and let the thought settle, not as a conclusion, but as a pause. He would not strike again today. The salt could wait, and behind him, the mine remained silent, but the air felt different, as if it had shifted again, as if it, too, was waiting. Tomas remained still for a long time after setting the lantern down, his eyes fixed not on the wall of salt before him, but on the subtle glow it seemed to give off, a dull gleam like the skin of something half buried, as though the stone were not simply reflecting the flame, but emitting something of its own, some quiet memory stored in its mineral bones, now spilling faintly into the space between them. He had stopped working not out of fear or even exhaustion, but because the impulse to continue had faded like smoke. The pick, which only a moment ago had felt like an extension of his will, now rested forgotten at his side, its metal edge dulled by repeated blows, its wooden handle damp with the sweat of hands that no longer gripped it. The salt in front of him was not like the others. It was too smooth, too fine in its breakage, too willing to fracture. There was something about it that unnerved him. Not violently, not urgently, but deeply, like the faint tug of a dream that lingers even after waking. He leaned back against the cold stone of the opposite wall, letting the curve of his spine settle into the natural bend of the tunnel, the uneven rock pressing into his shoulder blades through the thin fabric of his shirt. The air was very still now, disturbed only by the softness of the lantern and the barely perceptible rustle of dust as it settled slowly from his earlier work. Somewhere far behind him, a drop of water struck stone, the sound hollow and distant, like a voice trying to reach through layers of silence. The mine around him felt vast, not in the way a landscape feels vast, with open skies and distant trees, but in the way a cave feels vast, close and deep and endless in all directions, the kind of vastness that presses in rather than opens out. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the glow from the salt walls seemed to linger, not as light, but as presence. It was as if the mine had followed him inside his own mind, its corridors branching through his thoughts, its shadows pooling in the corners of memory. He thought, not for the first time, of the stories that passed quietly between men on their bunks, of old tunnels sealed for safety, of chambers where the salt had grown so unstable that it hummed faintly with every step, of shafts abandoned not for danger, but for something stranger, something no one could quite name. Sometimes, men said they saw things, shapes, movements, flashes of something that vanished the moment it was noticed, but most agreed these were dreams, or exhaustion, or the mind's way of reminding them of their place. Tomas had never spoken of his own glimpses. He had seen shapes too, faint figures caught in the periphery of torchlight, footprints where no one had walked, tools left in one place appearing in another. But he had learned not to trust these things, not because they weren't real, but because they were too real. The mind revealed what it wanted, when it wanted, and any attempt to question it only led to deeper confusion. Best to keep one's head down, to break the salt, to carry the cart, to sleep and wake and do it again. And yet now, in this quiet moment, with no footsteps behind him, no voices ahead, no clanging of carts or coughing of dust-filled lungs, he found himself wondering if perhaps the mine had never been simply a place. Perhaps it had always been something more, a presence, a mind, slow and vast and ancient, older than the men who carved into it, older than the tools they wielded or the coins they earned. Perhaps every swing of a pick was not just a blow against stone, but an intrusion into memory. Perhaps the warmth behind the salt wall was not heat, but breath. His hand drifted to the pick again, but not to lift it, only to rest his fingers along its handle, feeling the smooth grain of the wood, the fine cracks where it had begun to split. It was an old tool. He had used it for years. It bore the shape of his hands, the weight of his labor. He would lift it again soon. He would strike the salt, but not yet. He let his head tilt to one side, cheek resting against the rock, and breathed slowly. The tunnel was darker now, the torch behind him burning lower, the edges of its light curling inward like the petals of a dying flower. His eyelids grew heavier. Sleep was a dangerous thing in the mine, but not impossible. Not if one trusted the ground, not if one let the body yield without fear. He would only rest for a moment, just enough to ease the tightness in his chest, the ache in his spine, just enough to hear the mind breathe again. And in that moment, with his eyes closed and the salt pressing quietly against the silence, Tomas thought of nothing at all. There were no thoughts of home. He had none. No thoughts of future. The future did not exist here. There was only this moment, this breath, this stone. The salt wall before him shimmered softly in the dim, as if smiling in some ancient way, not kindly, but knowingly. It did not threaten. It did not promise. It simply was. He did not sleep, not truly, but his mind drifted low and slow, like water beneath ice, and in that drifting, the mind held him, not cruelly, not gently, but completely. Time passed, though how much could not be measured, not in minutes or hours, not in any way that held meaning beneath the earth where days did not dawn and nights never fell. Tomas remained in the hollowed corridor, his back to the wall, his head resting lightly on stone, his breath moving in and out like the tide, slow and shallow, as though drawn by something older than lungs. Around him, the mine was utterly still. Even the low creak of timber beams had quieted, as if the structure itself had paused in its endless labor, holding its breath along with him. When he finally opened his eyes again, it was not because he had woken from sleep. He had not truly slept, but because something had changed in the silence. It was not sound exactly, but the absence of it, the kind of absence that draws attention, the kind that turns silence into something alive. He sat up slowly, joints complaining, the edge of the pick pressing against his thigh where it had lain undisturbed, its metal slick now with condensation. The torch had nearly died. Only a thin thread of flame remained, flickering inside the soot-blackened cage like the last ember of a thought. And the salt wall before him, now dark, now cold, seemed just as he had found it. No glow, no shimmer, only salt. He rose without hurry. His knees cracked as he straightened, and he rolled his shoulders once, shaking the numbness from his arms. He left the wall unbroken, the seam unfinished, the salt undisturbed. Something in him had shifted, not in fear nor in awe, but in understanding. Whatever had pulsed behind the stone had passed. Or perhaps it was still there, only quieter, content to wait again. Either way, Tomas no longer felt the need to reach for it. He had touched the edge of something ancient and unknowable, and that was enough. As he made his way back to the tunnel, the mind seemed different, not lighter, not kinder, but somehow softer in its silence, as though it had accepted him more fully now, acknowledged his presence not as intrusion, but as inevitability. He was not a stranger here. He was not even a worker, not truly. He was part of the structure, part of the breath, a moving piece within a body of salt that did not sleep, did not age, did not remember names, but recognized motion and repetition and submission. He passed old beams, their surfaces coated in powdery crystals that shimmered faintly in the low light, past side tunnels where carts had once rattled and where silence now stretched unbroken. Each step felt strangely light, though his legs ached and his hands throbbed with pain. It was a kind of lightness that comes not from ease, but from acceptance. He no longer fought the weight of the mind. He carried it as one carries breath. It was not outside him. It was within. When he emerged once more into the main passage, where the torchlight grew brighter and the sound of shovels echoed faintly through the stone, he did not speak. A few others worked in silence nearby, heads down, eyes hollow with the same steady resolve. None looked up. They did not need to. They had all felt it at some point. That shift in the mind's presence, that moment when salt and stone ceased to be object and became something else, something watching. None of them spoke of it. It was not for speech. It was only for knowing. He passed them without words, nodding once to a man whose face he recognized, but whose name had long since faded from memory. The man did not nod back, but simply resumed his swinging. The rhythm of labor did not pause. Not for wonder, not for memory, not even for fear. The mind allowed no such interruptions. Tomas returned his pick to the tool room, placing it carefully on the low rack where others lay in quiet rows, their metal heads nicked and scarred, their handles worn smooth by generations of fingers. He washed his hands in the cold basin outside, watching the pink-tinged water swirl briefly before vanishing down a rusted drain. The blood had mixed with salt again. It always did. He rubbed his face dry with a cloth stiff from use, then stepped out into the yard, where dusk had fallen unnoticed and the wind had risen once more. The dormitory's door creaked on its hinge. The same sound as always. Inside, the room was dim, the stove glowing with low orange coals. Men lay on their bunks already, their bodies curled into familiar shapes. Faces turned toward the wall, or the ceiling, or nowhere at all. The air was warmer here, but not warm, just less cold. The kind of comfort one learns not to expect, but still welcomes when it comes. He crossed the floor without sound and settled onto his bunk, pulling the rough blanket up to his chest, his eyes adjusting to the low light. His breath slowed, his thoughts softened. He lay still, not waiting for sleep, but allowing it to find him, as it always did. Eventually, outside, the mind remained, its walls held fast. Its tunnels reached endlessly into the earth, folding over themselves, winding like veins through a body too vast to map. And deep within those walls, the salt whispered still, carrying memories no man could name, dreams no man could hold. The mind did not end. It continued long after footsteps faded, long after picks were dropped and carts left to rust. It remembered the shape of labor, the echo of breath, the weight of pain. Tomas slept, and in his sleep, the salt mind slept with him. Not gently, not cruelly, but completely. And now, with the salt quiet once again and the echoes faded into stillness, let your mind settle into the calm, let your breath soften and allow your body to drift down to rest. The story has ended, but the silence remains. You are safe now. You are still. Sleep deeply. Sleep peacefully. Sleep